Chapter 1171. May 28th, Royal City Drill Ground. At 9 in the morning, Ouyang Shaw, accompanied by Military Affairs Minister Du Ruhui and City Guard Commander Shi Wansui, entered the drill ground and sat in the middle of the viewing platform. Blood Romance, Xie and the other guild leaders were led by the Imperial Guard to their designated seats. The Imperial Guard drill ground was a restricted military area. Ordinary people couldn't enter. Banners fluttered on the drill ground. Every 100 steps, an Imperial Guard in radiant armor stood guard. The security was tight. In the middle of the drill ground, two dueling teams were already in position. This time, Great Xia had sent out the 1st Battalion of the 1st Division, 1st Brigade, and 1st Battalion, personally led by Zhao Sihu. Just from the designation, it was obvious that this was the strongest battalion of the city guards. Ouyang Shua's exclusion of the Divine Guard and Imperial Guard didn't mean that he looked down on the guild's elite team. The 1st Battalion was a mixed battalion made up of sword and shield soldiers, pikemen, and archers. This was also the standard configuration of Great Xia's infantry. Experience in previous wars proved that a single unit wasn't suitable for complex battlefields. It lacked flexibility and toughness. Only a mixed battalion could truly display the advantages of each unit and increase the lethality and survivability of the battlefield. After everyone was present, the host of the duel, Du Ruhui, read the rules of the duel. This duel is a duel to the death. It doesn't matter if one side lives or dies. The duel will end with the destruction or surrender of one side. The location of the duel is limited to the designated area of the drill ground. There are no restrictions on the method of combat. After reading the rules, Du Ruhui glanced at the king. Seeing the king nod, she immediately said, "The duel begins." Boom, boom, boom. The sound of the war drums shook the sky, gradually stirring up the blood of the soldiers on the field. Because it was a duel on the drill ground, there were no tricks to speak of. It was all about strength. Amidst the beating of the war drums, the two teams moved from slow to fast, roaring as they charged at each other. Just from this alone, one could see the difference between the regular army and the elite team. Although the elite team was already consciously controlling their formation, when they moved faster, their formation was still not orderly. There was even a slight disconnect between the front and back. On the other hand, the city guards were like a group, maintaining a square formation. On the stage, Blood Romance could only shake her head helplessly. This couldn't be helped. No matter how much the players trained, they couldn't get into character without military rules. Even so, Bloody Romance was not worried at all. Fighting on the battlefield relied on strength, not some damn formation. As long as they could kill the enemy, it didn't matter if their formation was neat or not. Amidst the high-speed movement, the archers of the elite squad finally revealed their abilities. They could actually shoot while moving. Sharp arrows shot towards the city guards, causing a certain amount of disruption to the city guards. In the blink of an eye, 3 or 4 people were shot and fell to the ground. The entire formation was inevitably affected. Commander Zhao Sihu saw this and ordered, "Block." With his schwa sound, shields were either placed in front of them or raised high above their heads to block the arrows. As such, even though they managed to block the rain of arrows, their movement speed and formation were unavoidably affected. In the first round, the elite squad had the upper hand. As they spoke, the two teams were about to collide. At this moment, there was a sudden change in the city guards. The 2 rows of sword and shield soldiers at the front suddenly turned from a straight line to an arc. In the blink of an eye, they formed a circle with the sword and shield soldiers at the back. A formation. Bloody Romance's expression became solemn. This formation was the simplified version of the 3,000 Revolutions formation that Sun Bin had designed for the Divine Guard. The outer perimeter was guarded by sword and shield soldiers, the center was guarded by spearmen, and the archers were hidden in the center. Logically speaking, changing formations while running was a big taboo. If one wasn't careful, they could be scattered by the enemy. However, the city guards were facing an elite squad. They didn't have any cavalry or heavy armor. In the face of such a steel fortress, the elite squad was somewhat helpless. The solution they came up with was to move to the sides and attempt to surround the city guards. This seemed like a good idea, but it made a common mistake. The art of war said, surround them when they are 10. The elite squad had the same number of people as the city guards, 500. How could they possibly surround them? Zhao Sihu stood in the middle of the formation. When he saw the enemy split up, he immediately ordered, pierce, kill. In the blink of an eye, over 100 spears shot out from the shield soldiers like lightning. The entire formation's attack range was instantly extended. Some of the elite squad players misjudged the range of the spears and got too close. They were immediately hit. These players were also quite strong. They used their movement skills to twist left and right, dodging the spears one by one. Some of the more valiant ones even took the opportunity to counterattack. Sword light flashed, and spear was cut in half. In terms of individual combat power, these elite players had the upper hand over the city guards. Moreover, every one of them had a unique skill. Their speed and agility were above average. They also had a wide variety of skills and techniques. It was quite a headache to deal with. Seeing this, Bloody Romance nodded his head in satisfaction. His confidence wasn't without reason. Withdraw. Zhao Sihu was unfazed. Whoosh! The spears were instantly withdrawn. The adventurers let out a sigh of relief when they saw this. Some of the more daring ones even tried to take advantage of this opportunity to attack the sword-and-shield soldiers on the outer perimeter. Pierce! In less than 10 seconds, the spears stabbed out again, as fast as lightning. This time, the elite players finally miscalculated. In the blink of an eye, 5 or 6 players were pierced by the spears. They fell to the ground, heavily injured and bleeding. Some couldn't help but cry out. In order to deal with the challenges of Planet Hope, the lowest pain threshold in the game was 50. Some elite players even took the initiative to adjust it to 70. Some madmen even had a 100% pain threshold. For example, Ouyang Shua's pain threshold had gradually increased from 50. Last year, it was already 100%. After adjusting it, it was very beneficial to the cultivation of skills and techniques. It was very normal for players to cry out. No one would look down on them. Seeing this, medics rushed up from the periphery of the drill ground and carried them out of the battlefield for treatment. Ouyang Shua's goal was to subdue the elite players, not to increase the slaughter. Even if it was a life-and-death battle, he would do his best to save those he could. That was why medics were on standby. When Bloody Romance saw this, a complicated look flashed in his eyes. He didn't know that there was such an arrangement. The slaughter continued on the battlefield. The elite players were strong, but the city guards weren't to be trifled with. Their moves were extremely simple, and they only used the same few moves. However, each move had been practiced thousands of times. For example, the spearmen's stabs had long since become a part of their body's memory. Under Zhao Sihu's command, they were like machines, precise and precise. This kind of offensive power was not something adventurer players possessed. The combat styles of the regular army and the elite team were well displayed in this battle. One could only say that they each had their own merits. If they could learn from each other's strengths and combine them together, it would be very terrifying. Bloody Romance was a smart person. Seeing this, he fell into deep thought. Perhaps Ouyang Shua's true intention in agreeing to the duel was to let the guild leaders see this clearly. The elite teams joining the army might seem like they were being restricted, but in reality, they were building a solid foundation for their future on Planet Hope. Whether it was for the elite teams or for the individual players, the advantages outweighed the disadvantages. Thinking was one thing, but Bloody Romance still wanted to win this duel. At this moment, the situation on the battlefield changed. Facing the rotation formation of the city guards, the elite team thought of a way to break it. They split into groups of 5, lifted one of them up, and leaped forward. Like a flying man, they flew past the outer and middle circles of the city guards and headed straight for the core. This was a different kind of decapitation operation. The elite players were all skilled. While in the air, they were ready to attack. Like fish, they charged toward the core with unstoppable momentum. Fire! Although Zhao Sihu was surprised, he didn't slow down in the slightest. Zhao Sihu had never encountered such a strange tactic on the battlefield before. The regular army couldn't do something like this. Chapter 1172. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The archers in the center fired at the players in the air. Because they were using the divine crossbows, they were extremely fast and powerful. If the players were not careful, they could be hit and fall to the ground. If they fell to the ground, there was no chance of survival. The adventurers were not to be trifled with. Those who had been chosen to be the players in the air were all very skilled. Some could even change their positions in the air to avoid the arrows. In the blink of an eye, players landed in the center and began a massacre. If it were an ordinary army, they would have panicked by now. However, the city guard were different. They had experienced countless life and death situations. They were not panicked. The outer circle was still impenetrable, and the middle circle, under the personal leadership of Zhao Sihu, killed the invaders. Zhao Sihu was not only a commander, but also an expert. He wielded the 5 tigers, breaking the gate blade. Gaia had practiced it for a year, and it had long since reached perfection. It was no exaggeration to say that even the leader of an elite squad could not beat Zhao Sihu. This was also the stabilizing force that Ouyang Shua had arranged to prevent any accidents. Spread out. Zhao Sihu roared. He raised his blade, and with a sweep of his blade, a player was caught. Then, there was a flash of white light and a clanging sound. In less than half a minute, the player was taken down. After taking down one player, Zhao Sihu did not stop. He killed his way to the other players. He really came and went like the wind. Under Zhao Sihu's command, the city guards quickly stabilized their position and surrounded the so-called players in the air. This kind of deterrence was truly frightening. In the stands, not only Bloody Romance, but even Siesiyun and the other guild leaders couldn't help but cry out. Only now did they realize that they had underestimated the generals of the world. Especially after the update, these fierce generals had been strengthened. Every one of them was a god of death. If Zhao Sihu, a non-historical general, had such power, then what kind of power did legendary historical generals like Lu Bu, Eli, and Ma Chao have? Bloody Romance did not dare to think about it. He might not even be able to defeat Lu Bu in a fight. In the last World Martial Arts Conference, Crimson Romance had crushed all the experts in the world and won the title of #1 under heaven. Even Lin Jing, who had first-rate cultivation techniques and weapons, had lost to Crimson Romance. The pride of the adventurer players was crumbling. Gaia sure is biased. Scarlet Romance felt conflicted. On this point, Bloody Romance had misunderstood. Come to think of it, the players had only cultivated for 5 years. If they were to synchronize their cultivation with the real world, the time would be even shorter. It was only natural that they could not compare to historical generals like Lu Bu. In history, which one of the great generals like Lu Bu did not start practicing martial arts from a young age? Therefore, Gaia was very fair. If adventurers could easily defeat them, what was so special about historical generals? Were they cabbages that were worthless? That would be truly unfair. Soon, Zhao Sihu stabilized the situation on the battlefield, causing the elite group's airdrop plan to fail. Although it caused chaos in the city guards, they also killed more than 20 archers and suffered heavy losses. Now that the city guards were on guard, it was impossible for them to play the same trick again. The elite squad leader's face was a little ugly. He glanced at the stands and saw the guild leader's solemn expression from afar. He gritted his teeth and ordered, "Brothers, don't embarrass the guild. Attack!" Yes. When choosing which elite group to fight, Bloody Romance had asked for everyone's opinion. These people were willing to participate in the duel, so naturally, none of them were afraid of death. Every one of them was an iron-blooded man. Following the leader's order, the remaining members either formed parties or fought alone. They used all the skills they had learned in their lives and charged at the city guards. They looked as if they were facing death with equanimity. These men killed their way up to the city guards. Some used skills like hitting a bull from a mountain, piercing through the shields, and killing the sword-wielding soldiers behind them. Some used speed to attack the sword-wielding soldiers from tricky angles, aiming for the sword-wielding soldiers' faces. Some used brute body techniques to take on the city guards' attacks, using absolute strength to hit the shields. Some used their bare fists to strike the shields, creating a clanging sound. Some used strange weapons like whips to wrap around the spearmen's spears. Some even rolled up the spearmen and dragged them out of the formation. Some even used poison and tossed it into the formation. This caused a lot of trouble for the city guards. They had never seen such a strange attack before. Even when they fought against monsters, it wasn't this strange. In less than 15 minutes, the sword-wielding and shield-wielding soldiers on the outer perimeter suffered heavy losses. The center was also in chaos. At this critical moment, the city guards' iron discipline finally showed itself. The soldiers were not afraid of death. When someone in the outer perimeter fell, someone in the center would immediately walk over to take their place. There was no hesitation. Everyone had their own role to play, and even under such circumstances, the spearmen's assassination never stopped. Wave after wave of attacks came, causing great disruption to the elite team. Players constantly died in battle, turning into light and disappearing. The archers in the center dodged the poison while throwing arrows. They were incredibly brave. Zhao Sihu was like a god of war. He kept moving around, putting out fires while organizing attacks and boosting morale. He kept the entire formation going. Looking from a spectator's stands, the outer circle of the city guard's rotation formation was already in tatters under the strong attacks of the elite troops. It was on the verge of collapse, and it looked like it would fall apart at any moment. It could be seen how much pressure they were facing. Even so, the formation miraculously continued operating and stubbornly withstood the wave of attacks. Anyone with a discerning eye could tell that the city guard's individual fighting power could not compare to the elite squad, but when these normal soldiers worked together, they could bring out a terrifying power. This is the army. Iron discipline and the bonds of life and death formed through fighting for a long period of time caused the city guards to block attacks for their comrades without hesitation. To create a fighting chance, they could even sacrifice their own lives. No matter how familiar the elite squad was with each other, it was difficult for them to do this. The devastating battle continued, but the leaders of the guilds who were watching gradually fell silent. Both sides fiercely attacked and defended. No one wanted to lose, let alone retreat. Everyone used their full strength. They were fighting for glory, and they knew the importance of this battle. The drill ground was made of solid yellow soil. It was extremely hard, but under the battle between the two sides, dust was flying everywhere. The ground cracked, and blood mixed with the yellow soil. It was extremely glaring. It could be seen how tragic the battle was. As time passed, the situation of the battlefield changed again. The elite squad's attack was thwarted, and they lost their spirit. On the other hand, the city guards, after blocking the enemy's strongest attack, did not stop and brazenly launched a counterattack. Disperse. Zhao Sihu decisively ordered, dispersing the rotation formation. He prepared to take advantage of the enemy's loss of spirit to turn from defense to offense and launch a wave of counterattacks to completely defeat the enemy. Seeing this, the elite squad members showed a look of despair. If this continued, the elite squad of 500 people would really be beaten to a pulp, but they were not willing to admit defeat. This matter concerned the guild's honor, and even more so, their personal honor. Surrender? That's not the style of the bloody empire. At this moment, Ouyang Shaw, who had been silent, glanced at Du Ruhui beside him and said, "Sound the drums. This battle is over. Both sides have casualties, and there is no clear winner. It will be a draw." Du Ruhui thought for a while and saluted. "Yes." Then, she stood up and went to pass the order. Soon, the drums sounded on the drill ground. The city guards were the first to react. Without a trace of hesitation, they abruptly stopped their charge halfway and lined up on the spot. Seeing this, the elite squad members on the opposite side were shocked. The leader of the elite squad sighed inwardly, and then secretly let out a sigh of relief. He looked at Ouyang Shual on the stand with a complicated expression and said, "Line up." "Yes." Ouyang Shual took the initiative to stand up and went to the stand where Bloody Romance and the others were. He said, "The elite squad of the Bloody Empire Mercenary Group is worthy of being first-class warriors. They have opened my eyes. They are worthy of respect. If the battle continues, the casualties on both sides will rapidly increase. How about we consider a draw? The moment the drums sounded, Bloody Romance was already mentally prepared. Even so, he still took a deep breath and looked at Ouyang Shaw. As you say, he could not refuse such a suggestion. Ouyang Shaw nodded, turned around, and looked at the survivors lined up on the drill ground. He circulated his true chi and let his voice spread throughout the drill ground. Warriors, today you have contributed a battle full of blood, courage, and wisdom. You are worthy of the honor and mission you have shouldered. Each person will be rewarded with 300 gold as a congratulatory reward. The court will take care of the bereaved, and each person will receive 500 gold as compensation. Thank you, Your Majesty. The city guards were the first to react. Under Zhao Sihu's lead, they uniformly gave a standard military salute. The elite squad members hesitated for a moment, but they still followed suit. 300 gold was a lot of money even for elite players, but for the dead, 500 gold was like coal in a snowstorm. Ouyang Shua's generosity were really admirable. Seeing this, Ouyang Shua smiled and turned to look at Bloody Romance. I hope you don't mind me overstepping my bounds. It's just a pity that I couldn't recruit these warriors into the army. Bloody Romance's expression became solemn, and it was obvious that he had made a big decision. He cupped his hands and bowed. Your Majesty, I am completely convinced of your generosity. If you don't mind, please accept us and let us become part of the Great Xia army. Together, we will defend the glory of Great Xia and the glory of China. Seeing this, Ouyang Shua's eyes shone brightly. He said excitedly, It is a blessing for Great Xia to have the help of baleful blood mercenary group. I swear that I will not betray your trust today. A king's oath was as heavy as 1,000 pounds. Bloody Romance finally smiled, and he was completely convinced. Then he bowed again. When the elite squad on the drill ground saw this, they also gave a military salute. Although it was not very standard, it meant that a new era had arrived in Great Xia. Glory! Glory! On the drill ground, the two sides that had been fighting to the death shouted the same slogan. Chapter 1173. The north wind blew in the training grounds of the royal city. On the stage were two giants, one representing the pinnacle of the Huaxia region, the other the pinnacle of the guilds. Below the stage were soldiers waving their arms and cheering, stirring up the yellow dust. How could anyone not be moved by such a scene? Although Blood Romance had agreed to be incorporated, Ouyang Shua was not an insensible person. He gave the Bloodlust mercenary group a buffer. This integration can be done step by step. First, choose 4 elite groups to join the Imperial Guard and Dragon Stallion Army. They'll go with the army to India and test it out on the battlefield. When the time is right, we'll carry out a large-scale integration. In the meantime, the Bloodlust mercenary group can continue to be a civilian organization. There's no need to disband immediately. Blood Romance had no objections. Ouyang Shua's promise was not empty talk. There was a living example. In the first year of Gaia, the Rattlesnake mercenary group joined Shanghai City. For the 5 years had passed, and none of the original members had done badly. The commander of the Black Snake Arts, Black Snake, and the director of military intelligence, Cobra, were 2 intelligence giants. Although they did not appear to be prominent, the resources and power they wielded had long surpassed Blood Romance's. Their achievement points had reached an astonishing number. According to Black Snake, his personal authority had been promoted to rank C and was steadily advancing to rank B. This would have been unimaginable in the past. The members below them all held important positions. They were either town envoys, responsible for the intelligence work of an area, or chief instructors, who were swift and decisive in the army. These were tangible benefits. In comparison, the development of the guilds was too limited. Without a fixed territory, the guilds could only drift with the tide. If a big wave came, they might not be able to withstand it and face the risk of disbandment. Even if the guilds moved to a new territory, they would be restricted in every aspect. No matter which lord it was, they would not allow an uncontrollable force to appear in their territory. Taking in guilds was a trend that no one could reverse. Great Xia was just a step ahead. In the future, When the lords made similar requests, if the guilds refused, they would face the fate of being suppressed. In other words, the guilds would be driven out of their territory. Unfortunately, there was no land in the wilderness without a lord. Apart from a small number of NPC dynasties, more than 90% of the land was controlled by lords. If they were driven out of the territory, there would be no place for the guilds in the vast world. How could a guild compete with a territory with just this? From his point of view, Gaia was indeed too biased towards the overlords. It was practically trampling the adventurer players into the mud. Of course, those who truly had such thoughts were people with limited knowledge. They did not understand Gaia's deeper meaning. Putting aside the insanely high elimination rate of the overlord players and the fact that countless outstanding players had failed miserably on the road to supremacy, even a final victor like Ouyang Shuo would naturally have to shoulder the same standard of responsibility on Planet Hope in the future while he obtained great power. With great power comes great responsibility. This was not just a saying. Gaia's calculations were always made from the perspective of humans. He would never be biased. As for this special care he gave Binger previously, no one could blame him because it had nothing to do with the bigger picture. After all, Gaia was also a human, and humans had preferences. Taking 10,000 steps back, 6 years before Gaia, it was the overlord players who tore through all the obstacles in the wilderness. They turned swords into plows, wiping out bandits, building cities and fortifications, reclaiming the desolate lands, and restoring peace. There were victors like Ouyang Shuo, as well as countless losers who contributed their strength. In this peaceful and prosperous era, they should have a part in the Medal of Merit. Because of this, the overlord players who failed also gained something when the achievement points were tabulated. During this period, the adventurer players had been holed up in the capital, enjoying the protection of the capital and living a comfortable life. Now that the wilderness was peaceful, the guilds had moved to the territory and continued to enjoy the protection. How was this fair? Now it was time for the overlord players to enjoy the fruits of victory. Now that things had developed to this point, it was a win-win situation between the guild and the territory. If they worked together, it would be a win-lose situation. The true purpose of Ouyang Shuo's actions over the past few days was to clearly convey this idea to the guild leaders. As long as one was not an idiot, they would have already understood this point. Crimson Romance was clearly not an idiot. Otherwise, he would not have truly let go of his pride and choose to lower his head to Grand Xia just because of Ouyang Shuo's performance. The duel was ultimately just a formality. On the viewing platform, Ouyang Shuo took the initiative to shake hands with Crimson Romance as he watched the cheers grow louder and louder. From now on, they were in the same boat, working together for a common goal. The position of Emperor Xia was not a feudal monarch's authority, but a heavy responsibility. Seeing this, Xie smiled and said to Crimson Romance, "Snow Rose wanted to be the first guild to accept the reorganization. I didn't expect you to beat me to it. It's not too late." Crimson Romance was in a good mood. Yes. Our Blood Shadow Alliance will also have a share." Bright Moon Illuminates the River hurriedly expressed his support. Since the three powerhouses had already agreed, the other guild leaders were tactful and expressed their support. Similar to the strategy with Baleful Blood Mercenaries, the Imperial Court would not reorganize all the guilds at once. Instead, it would allow the guilds to select their elites to join the army. This would effectively stifle internal opposition within the guilds. Ouyang Shuo was in no hurry. Just as he had said before, this is the general trend, and it is not something that can be reversed by a human. Once the general trend is formed, it is unstoppable. It is like the surging sea, sweeping away all obstacles and rushing forward endlessly. Every unparalleled hero was a person who could lead the general trend. The 1st of June, the month of war officially began. The wilderness, which had been peaceful for a while, was once again engulfed the whole world. Under such circumstances, the war in the Huaxia region seemed a little dull. In the north, the Romanov dynasty only sent a symbolic troop to harass the border of Liaojin province. There was no sign of a large-scale invasion of Xia. In fact, there was not a single adventure player from the Russian region on the battlefield. It was not only the Huaxia players who were afraid of war. Even the warring tribes became fearful after this round of updates. Moreover, they had to travel tens of thousands of miles to invade Xia. No one had anything better to do. Emperor Pushkin of the Romanov dynasty chose to target the Huaxia region because he had no other choice. To the north of the Russian region was the uninhabited Arctic Ocean. To the east was the North American continent, which was the territory of the Dawson dynasty. To the south was the Huaxia region. To the southwest was their ally, the Persian Empire. To the west was the European continent. Apart from the Huaxia region, they were all allies. Originally, it was the best choice for the Russian region to take the opportunity of the month of war to attack a small European country. However, the Silver Hand did not allow them to do so. Within the Silver Hand, the Pushkin family was an awkward existence. The European and American clans guarded against them like thieves and did not give the Pushkin family a chance to grow. Under such circumstances, how could the Russian region be allowed to declare war on the European continent? Under such circumstances, Pushkin chose the Huaxia region as his opponent. However, he did not have any desire to conquer the Huaxia region because it was not worth it. This was why the Romanov dynasty made such a perfunctory move. In the southwest, Java was also in an awkward situation. If Great Xia took the initiative to fight across the sea like last year, then in order to protect their homeland and not become slaves of a subjugated country, Java would definitely overcome their fear and fight to the death. The Java Lord, UIS, could only rely on the strength of the players to fight to the death with Great Xia. Unexpectedly, Great Xia did not fall for it all. The war had already begun, but there were no signs of attacking Java. They only arranged for the Halua army and the Southern Frontier Army to be stationed on the surrounding islands and put on a defensive posture. As a result, the Java players were not as enthusiastic. With the destruction of the Badong fleet, the huge risk of fighting across the sea was enough to wear down any courage. Not to mention the players, even the territorial army of Badong City did not dare to go out to sea. The atmosphere became awkward. The only movement might be the collision between the Indian region and Great Xia. After learning that the adventure groups of the Great Zhou dynasty, the Great Jin dynasty, and the Huaxia region were successively defeated, the Indian region was very ambitious. The various forces united together and shouted the slogan, "Retake the first region of Asia." Even the adventurer players of the Indian region were very enthusiastic this time. From their point of view, there was no reason for India to lose when they attacked a single opponent from Great Xia with just one district strength. Since that was the case, they naturally had to take the opportunity to catch up and reap the benefits. To be honest, it was the dream of the Indians to be arrogant in the territory of Huaxia. Chapter 1174. On the first day of June, the 700,000-strong army of the Peacock dynasty assembled at the border of the Great Xia's River Tao province. Accompanying them were more than 100,000 combat professional players. At the same time, the Gudo dynasty, under the escort of a fleet, was expected to land on the southern coast of the River Tao province or the southwestern coast of the Hanoi province. The Gudo dynasty's plan was that if they could restrain the Halua army of the Great Xia, it would create an opportunity for the Kingdom of Java to attack. In this way, they could also share the pressure on the Peacock dynasty on the battlefield, killing two birds with one stone. The Great Xia's response was somewhat shabby. The Southern Frontier Army and the Halua Army guarded the islands against the Kingdom of Java. The Hanoi Army was responsible for guarding the monster nests in the River Tao province and could not participate in the battle. The Imperial Guards set up defenses along the coast, making full use of the cavalry's mobility advantage, and were ready to meet the Gudo dynasty's army at any time. The Dragon Stallion Army was deployed at the border of the River Tao province to meet the Peacock dynasty's army. The final count of adventurers in the River Tao province was less than 50,000. Basically, the Great Xia army was fighting 1 against 2, which was very worrying. The city guards had prepared a corps as a reserve, ready to reinforce the front line at any time. In addition, The Leopard Army, Stalwart Tiger Army, and Soaring Eagle Army were not prepared to be mobilized. The previous battle had exhausted the resources of the Piao Kingdom, which was now the River Tao province. The war resources stored in the Hanoi province were also stretched thin and could not support the consumption of 1 million troops. Ouyang Shuo had steeled his heart and was not prepared to go all out. Ever since the 6th update, the army was no longer made of iron. Not only did they have to make up for the casualties, but they also needed time to rest and recuperate. Mobilizing the Dragon Stallion Army and the Imperial Guards was already a last resort. Under such circumstances, the Great Xia Army was destined to defend instead of attack. It was just that it was not an easy task to guard it well. First of all, in the River Tao province, in the previous battle, the border fortifications were almost completely destroyed, and it was impossible to build a new line of defense in a short period of time. As such, Bai Qi could only rely on the 5 border cities to build a city defense chain. If the Peacock dynasty was not greedy, the surrounding villages were bound to suffer. The Imperial Guards were also not easy to defend. Huotsubing stationed his infantry at a few cities along the coast that had ports. The rest of the cavalry was spread out and prepared to move when the opportunity arose. They would make further arrangements after the Gudad dynasty's army disembarked. At the same time, in order to reduce the defensive pressure on the Imperial Guards, the Indian Ocean Fleet's 2nd Formation and 5th Formation strengthened their patrols in the surrounding waters. Although they were unable to face the Gudo dynasty's naval fleet head-on, they could still greatly reduce the Gudo dynasty's landing area and reduce the defensive pressure of the Imperial Guards. Otherwise, the Imperial Guards wouldn't be able to keep up with the vast coastline. The 1st Formation of the Indian Ocean Fleet stationed at the headquarters in Los Leones and the 4th Formation stationed in Auckland were responsible for sealing off the waters around Java. The Indian Ocean Fleet was also very busy. June 2nd, Pangbin City. Pangbin was a small border city in the west of the Hatao province. The border was 100 kilometers west of the city. Because Pangbin City was in the middle of the border, Bai Qi chose it as a temporary headquarters. The 35 Dragon Stallion armies used these 5 small border cities as hubs to coordinate with each other. Just the day before, the scouts of both sides had already exchanged more than 100 blows at the border. Some daring adventurers were unwilling to be left out and were active in the forest at the border. The killing had already begun the moment the national war began. The 6th system update had an effect on the national war. The buffs brought by the country's honor points and the strengthening buffs from the nation weapons had all been removed. This was clearly very unfair to the Huaxia region. For this reason, Gaia had offered a compensation plan. It was to allow Ouyang Shuo to summon an additional 100,000 Imperial Guards in addition to the usual 5% of the Royal City Imperial Guards during the National War. After the system update, the Royal City Imperial Guards have been reduced by half. In addition to the destruction of Dali, the ratio of 5 to 5 meant that he could only summon 220,000 Royal City Imperial Guards. Because the Indian region only had 1 Royal City, the Imperial Guard were not damaged. As the leader of the national war in the Indian region, the Peacock King could summon 250,000 Imperial Guards. Of course, with the addition of 100,000 people, the situation was different. In addition, the Huaxia NPC dynasty had a long history, so the quality of the Imperial Guards was also higher than that of the Indian region. Great Qin's army of tigers and wolves, the Great Han Iron Cavalry. Which one of them wasn't a world-class army? This time, Ouyang Shuo was going to make an example out of the Great Han dynasty. Emperor Wu of Han was entrenched in the Central Plains. When he sent an envoy to the royal court last year, he didn't mention anything about offering the 9 province cauldrons. This made Ouyang Shuo very angry. If there was a chance, he would naturally teach the Great Han dynasty a lesson. Ever since Ouyang Shuo started the 9 province cauldrons mission, he had only received the 9 province cauldrons from Dali, Chuanzhou, Xiangyang, and Jianya. There was no movement from the other 5 royal city. This time, he was teaching the Great Han dynasty a lesson so that he could complete the 9 province cauldrons mission as soon as possible. This would remove the final obstacle for the Great Xia dynasty to become the world's first dynasty. As for the Shuhan Imperial Guards and the Great Sui dynasty, he could think of other ways to weaken them. The Shuhan Imperial Guards' 500,000 Imperial Guards had already been reduced by 100,000 by Ouyang Shua. There were only 400,000 of them left. With the strength of the Northwest War Zone, even if it was a frontal attack, they would be able to get rid of the Shuhan Imperial Guards. There was no need to waste this precious summoning opportunity. As for the Great Sui dynasty, they basically had no ambition. If Ouyang Shua mobilized 320,000 Imperial Guards in one go, they would only be left with 180,000 Imperial Guards. How would they fight the Great Xia dynasty? Before the start of the Kingdom War, the Great Han dynasty had already secretly formulated a military plan to attack the Great Han dynasty. Once the Kingdom War ended, the Great Xia dynasty would officially declare war on the Great Han dynasty. The one in charge of this war was the newly established Southeast War Zone. The only difficulty was that the Great Han dynasty didn't border the Great Xia dynasty, but the Great Zhou dynasty. The true test for the Southeast War Zone was how to quickly take down the Great Han dynasty without letting the Great Zhou dynasty reap the benefits. Back to the main topic. Pangbin City governor's estate. Bai Qi was holding a military meeting to give his final instructions for the war. What was strange was that Bai Qi didn't summon the commanders to Pangbin City for a meeting. Instead, he held a video conference through a communication compass. Each of the 5 armies was responsible for guarding one of the 5 border cities. If the commanders went to Pangbin City for a meeting, not only would it be unsafe, it would also be inefficient. With the communication compass, things became much simpler. Gaia's introduction of this communication device made Bai Qi and the other historical generals very uncomfortable at the start. It was as if their military deployment had suddenly become completely secret. Many tactics that had been proven to be effective suddenly became useless. If they didn't make any changes, they could get into trouble on the battlefield at any time and give the enemy an opportunity to attack. Because of this, the Great Xia army was a laughingstock. For example, during the war with the Piao Kingdom, the Hanoi army was responsible for advancing into the north of the Piao Kingdom, sweeping the periphery of the royal city and cutting off the supplies of the royal city. The 1st Legion of the Hanoi army was led by Pei Xinjian as the vanguard of the army. In the end, Pei Xinjian was careless and forgot about the existence of the communication compass. He wanted to use the usual surprise attack tactics of the Great Xia cavalry, but he didn't know that their whereabouts had long been discovered by the Piao Kingdom players. The consequences were naturally imaginable. The originally anticipated surprise attack suddenly turned into a farce of being ambushed by the enemy. If it wasn't for the tenacity of the Hanoi army and the timely arrival of reinforcements, they would probably have suffered a great loss. Even so, they still lost more than 10,000 elites. This battle was used as a negative example and was disseminated to the entire army. It made the Great Xia generals deeply understand the deep impact of the communication compass on the war. The so-called surprise attack would be very difficult to achieve in a war filled with players. This was especially so in a non-local situation, where the battlefield was filled with the eyes of the enemy, and there was nowhere to hide for large-scale military operations. Of course, the ultimate goal of Gaia's introduction of the communication compass was to benefit the people. After the historical generals familiarized themselves with the device, they realized that it was more useful than thousands of troops and horses. If used well, the advantages would outweigh the disadvantages. Just like the current video conference, the 5 generals Zhao Bonu, Lai Huer, Zhang Liao, Luo Shixin, and Xiao Chaogui were already used to it. Although the 5 legions were scattered in 5 cities, they could constantly maintain contact with the command center. They received orders from the command center almost at the same time and reported their respective situations. To a commander, this was a dream come true. As a god general, Bai Qi was naturally the first to understand the essence of the communication compass and put it to good use. Not only could he command the battlefield in Hatao, but he could also control the Hanoi army, Nanjiang army, and Hulua army. He didn't need to leave Pangbin City to command the entire Southwest War Zone. This was something unimaginable in the past. The Kingdom War will only last for a month. As the attacking party, the enemy will definitely be impatient. As long as we remain patient, we will definitely be able to find an opportunity to launch a counterattack. After Bai Qi finished speaking, he instructed, but before His Majesty arrives at the front lines, all the divisions have to defend the cities to the death. No matter how the enemy provokes you, you must not leave the cities to fight. Otherwise, it will affect the overall situation. Understood? Yes. Through the screen, the 5 commanders saluted in unison. Chapter 1175. On the 4th day of the 6th month, the 500,000-strong army of the Maudwood dynasty successfully landed at Baixing City, south of the Hetao province. After fighting with the imperial guards stationed there for a day, they successfully occupied the city and obtained a forward operating base. The Hendo dynasty was very smart. In the end, they still chose the River Tao region, which was easier to conquer, as a breakthrough point. The Hetao province had just returned to Great Xia, and the defenses of the coastal cities had yet to be rearranged. The P1 cannons had yet to be installed at the top of the city walls, giving the Rahuo dynasty an opportunity. If it was Hanoi province, the situation would be different. The imperial guards had less than 10,000 infantry soldiers stationed in the city. Seeing that the situation was dire, they could only choose to retreat strategically and wait to regroup with the main force before making further plans. During this period, the army of the Peacock Imperial Court also frequently moved out at the border, sweeping away the sentry posts, villages, and watchtowers of the Great Xia dynasty. The Great Xia army could only gather in the city to defend and didn't dare to act blindly without thinking. Looking at the situation, the Indian region was preparing to concentrate their forces and take down the Hetao province in one fell swoop in order to seize tangible benefits. It was rare to find someone who wasn't greedy. It was just that this was the first time the Xia kingdom had been in such a passive situation. It was truly vexing. The morale of the India region was high after the consecutive victories. Some of the domestic players who were still watching the battle were already ready to make a move. They were ready to rush to the front lines in an attempt to get a share of the loot in the Kingdom War. On the contrary, the global public opinion was overwhelmingly ridiculing Great Xia. The throat of public opinion was originally in the hands of the Silver Hand and the Azure Badge. How could they let go of such an opportunity? In the past few days, the media had carried out a series of reports on the Xia Kingdom's misfortune, constantly singing the Xia Kingdom's praises. Needless to say, there were actually people who believed him. Public opinion was also an invisible killing knife. If used well, it could also be used to defend against thousands of troops and horses. What made Ouyang Shuo feel slightly gratified was that while the so-called mainstream media was criticizing Great Xia, there were still people who stood up and spoke for Great Xia. With the power of Great Xia alone, they didn't even dispatch half of the imperial court's military force. Yet they were able to block the attack of the Indian district. Who can match such power? I really don't know how strong those people who say Great Xia is. You're not strong enough, yet you're still trying to discredit your opponent. How despicable. Even though this voice was very weak, it was sufficient to prove that the Grand Xia dynasty led by Ouyang Shuo had obtained a certain level of acknowledgement not only in the Huaxia region, but even in the entire world. This was like a sprout. As long as Great Xia persevered, it would eventually grow into a towering tree. Under such circumstances, Ouyang Shuo's party arrived at Heavy Bin City. Apart from the 3,000 divine guards, there were also 20,000 elite combat players. The duel a week ago ended with all the guilds bowing their heads to Great Xia. Since that was the case, now that Great Xia was under great pressure at the border, these guilds naturally did not hesitate to send their elite players to the front lines to provide support. Pangbin City, City Lord Residence. Bai Qi briefly introduced the situation of the battlefield to the king, and then said, "With the current strength of the enemy, if they dare to forcibly break through the defensive line, they will be courting death. I don't think they are that stupid. There are only 2 choices in front of the enemy. They can either summon the imperial guards of the capital and gather their superior forces to take down one of the border cities, or they can stay in a stalemate and wait for the army of the Godo dynasty to rendezvous with them. I think that the former option is more likely. Although the Godo dynasty has taken down Baishan City, they will not be able to rendezvous with the encirclement of the Imperial Guards in a short period of time. They can't afford to drag it out. Therefore, the biggest possibility is to cut the Gordian knot and carry out the tactic of taking them down one by one. Ouyang Shuan nodded his head. Bai Qi was indeed Bai Qi. He had already figured out most of the enemy's movements. In view of Bai Qi's past combat style, Ouyang Shua smiled and said, I believe that the general already has a countermeasure. The enemy doesn't know that your majesty can summon an additional 100,000 Imperial Guards to assist us. This is our opportunity. If we make good use of it, we can counter-encircle the enemy and create an opportunity, Bai Qi replied. Ouyang Shua understood. The reason why the Great Xia army was always victorious was not only because of their extraordinary combat strength, but also because Ouyang Shua always had an endless number of trump cards. At the crucial moment, he would always give the enemy a fatal blow. Bai Qi obviously knew how to make use of his trump cards. Ouyang Shua smiled and took out a talisman. He handed it to Bai Qi and said, in addition to the 100,000 Imperial Guards, this should be able to help the general. Bai Qi took a look and was pleasantly surprised. Spirit Attraction Talisman. After use, 10 times the usual number of monsters will surge out of the monster nest. This talisman was given to Ouyang Shua by Bloody Romance 2 days ago as a gift. At first glance, this talisman didn't seem like a good thing. If 10 times the number of monsters were drawn out, wouldn't it be self-inflicted? A normal monster tide was already tiring enough to deal with. If 10 times the number of monsters was increased, no one would be able to stop it. At first, Ouyang Shua suspected that Bloody Romance was deliberately giving him an item that she didn't need as a gift. But after thinking about it carefully, as long as this item was used in the right place, it could be very effective. For example, on the current battlefield, Bai Qi naturally understood the king's intention. He smiled and said, Your Majesty, there is a large monster nest north of the border. Due to the serious disturbance caused by the enemy, the Hanoi army stationed there has already withdrawn from their camp. Ouyang Shua nodded. General, you can arrange this matter as you see fit. Ouyang Shua rushed to the front line this time to supervise the battle and boost the morale of the entire army. He didn't take over the command of the army. The specific battle would be handled by the command center led by Bai Qi. Understood. Bai Qi saluted. As time entered the 6th month, the monster nest became more and more restless. The number of monsters that poured out was already increasing. If 10 times the number of monsters were drawn out, it would be enough to give the Peacock Dynasty army stationed nearby a hard time. Bai Qi gradually began to plan in his heart. After the meeting, Ouyang Shua left 20,000 combat players under Bai Qi's command. He himself took 3,000 Divine Guards and left the city to patrol the other border cities. With the Divine Guards accompanying him, the Peacock Dynasty army really couldn't do anything to Ouyang Shua. If the Peacock King was really obsessed and wanted to kill Emperor Xia, Ouyang Shua didn't mind using himself as bait to lure the Peacock Dynasty. Don't forget, Ouyang Shua could summon 320,000 Imperial Guards at any time. Peacock Dynasty, Embark City. Like Pangbin City, Embark City was also a small border city. However, it was located in the Peacock Dynasty's territory and was far away from Pangbin City. Therefore, it was chosen as the frontline command center of the Peacock Dynasty. During this time, the Peacock Dynasty's army had swept the surrounding areas. The arrival of Ouyang Shua naturally couldn't be hidden from their eyes and was quickly reported to the command center. City Lord's residence. The Peacock King knew that Emperor Xia had personally come to the front line. While the Peacock King was proud, he also felt a sense of urgency. He said to the generals in the hall, "We can't drag this any longer." The king of Manduo, Akbar, was also an old fox. After he led his troops to take down Baishang City, he did not rush to the north to join the Peacock Dynasty army. Instead, he used the reason of waiting for provisions and supplies to stay in Baishang City. As an emperor, how could the Peacock King not know Akbar's plan? Akbar was afraid of the great Xia imperial guards and did not dare to fight them head-on. He was counting on the Peacock dynasty to open up the situation and reap the benefits. Even if the two old rivals joined forces, they each had their own ulterior motives. The Goodod dynasty could drag it out because Akbar had no ambition for the territory of the River Tao province. He was only participating in the war with the intention of plundering and earning merit points along the way to win the support of the Indian players. The Peacock King was different. For the Peacock dynasty, this was their best chance to take down Hatao province. It could even be their only chance. Who knew what kind of monster the Great Xia would grow into in next year's war? Coupled with the Peacock King's greater ambition than the King of Manduo, the Peacock dynasty's army was destined to take the initiative. Seeing that a week was about to pass, they must do something. Otherwise, they would miss this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We will follow the king's orders. The generals in the hall cupped their fists one by one and were also in high spirits. The Peacock King's eyes swept across and said in a deep voice, "From tomorrow onwards, execute the siege plan." Yes. At this point, this war finally ushered in the climax. Chapter 1176. On the 5th day of the 6th month, the Peacock dynasty's army made a new move. 500,000 of the 700,000 soldiers were left behind to hold the line, while the remaining 200,000 were moving toward the northernmost border city of the Hitao province, Niga City. 3 days later, the army had Niga City completely surrounded. The moment they arrived, the Peacock King immediately summoned 250,000 imperial guards to assist them. Thus, 450,000 soldiers surrounded this small border city. Niga City's defenses were inferior to Pangbin City's, and it was garrisoned by the 5th Legion of the Dragon Stallion Army. Given that Legion commander Xiao Chaoge had come from the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, this legion was also the 1st Legion of the Dragon Stallion Army to become a musketeer. Even so, they could not stop the vast enemy army. Bai Qi's order was, defend for 2 days, and reinforcements will come. On the walls of Niga City, Xiao Chaogue stood bravely on the walls, his expression grave as he gazed at the densely packed white tents outside. The 5th Legion was facing an enemy army 6 times their size, and it would not be easy for them to hold out for 2 days with the weak defenses of Niga City. But the order had already been issued. No matter how difficult it was, Xiao Chaogue had to resolutely carry it out. Pass on my orders to all divisions. There is no retreat in this battle. We can only defend to the death. If we cannot hold out, we will die with Niga City. Xiao Chaogue's voice was calm, but the order he issued was extremely somber. Yes, the messenger also had a solemn expression as he quickly turned and left. Outside the city, in the central army tent, the Peacock King was standing on a high ground, also gazing at the nearby Niga City. He noticed that the Dragon Stallion army on the walls was at its peak. Even in the face of a siege, they did not show the slightest fear. It is rumored that the Dragon Stallion army under the command of the great Xia slaughter god Bai Qi is a group of butchers from hell who kill without blinking an eye. It seems that the rumors are true. The Peacock King praised the enemy. The surrounding officers were clearly unconvinced, but they did not dare to retort. When speaking of the Peacock dynasty, the most famous army had to be the famous War Elephant Army. It was even stronger than the Shang dynasty's War Elephant Army, and it was an existence that struck fear into the hearts of those who heard its name. Unfortunately, war elephants could only play a small role in a siege battle. As a result, the Peacock King only brought a small number of war elephants for the final assault on the city gate. The Peacock King seemed to sense the mood of the general behind him. He changed the topic and said with a smile, "Even the Butcher of Hell cannot escape the punishment of the great god Shiva. It's time to let them see the power of the Peacock Army." At this point, the Peacock King suddenly turned around and shouted, "Who is willing to be the vanguard? This general is willing to go." The generals couldn't wait any longer, and all of them requested to go to battle. In the eyes of the generals, with such a large army besieging a small border city, wouldn't it be settled in one battle? Acting as the vanguard meant that they would obtain the greatest merit in this battle. No general could resist this kind of temptation. The Peacock King nodded in satisfaction. His gaze finally stopped on the young general at the very front. Cargill, you'll be the one to fight. Yes. Cargill raised his head in surprise. He was also a famous general in India's history, known for his bravery. When the other generals saw this, they were extremely jealous. The Peacock King did not placate them. He once again turned around and looked at the distant city, lost in thought. When the generals saw this, they very tactfully took their leave. They were well aware that the king's temperament was somewhat eccentric. He liked to imitate the historical Ashoka and had always been a man of his word. It was best not to provoke him. Very quickly, Cargill led his troops out of the camp and into formation outside the city. War drums beat and yellow sand filled the sky. It was in this nameless border town that the first large-scale battle of the national war broke out. The army of the Peacock Imperial Court, under the leadership of the young General Cargill, roared and charged towards the city walls. What they saw was not bloody slaughter, but brilliant military achievements. Unfortunately, the idea was good, but the reality was very cruel. The first wave of counterattack of the 5th Corps of the Dragon Stallion Army had already stunned the Peacock Imperial Court Army. First came round after round of cannons, followed by the roar of the ballistae, and finally the crisp sound of guns. Each round of attack reaped countless lives. The power of the firearm army was truly frightening. Because of the limitations of manufacturing technology, the defensive equipment of the Peacock Imperial Court Army was inferior to that of the Great Xiao Army. In the face of such a firearm attack, they appeared even weaker. The army that was charging at high speed fell down like wheat. The army of the Peacock Imperial Court was also brave and fierce. Even under such a fierce attack, they still charged forward without any regard for their lives, displaying a heroic spirit that was unafraid of death. When they finally reached the front, they found kerosene, rolling logs, stones, and other killing weapons waiting for them. Seeing his troops suffer setbacks, Cargill's expression did not change in the slightest. The first wave of attack was a probing attack, and the soldiers sent were all cannon fodder, the Imperial Guard. Their goal was to probe the defensive system of the city. Hey, they're quite well prepared. Cargill appeared indifferent on the surface, but his heart subconsciously tightened. He had not expected that the Dragon Stallion army that had hurriedly moved and would have such firepower. In particular, the volley of guns made Cargill very apprehensive. Continue forward. Although he was apprehensive, he still had to continue probing. This time, the 250,000 Imperial Guards summoned by the Peacock King were the best cannon fodder. Under Cargill's heart of stone, one unit after another was sent to the front lines, not giving the defenders any chance to breathe. As time went on, the Dragon Stallion Army's firepower network began to falter. Although the P1 cannons had been improved, it was inevitable that the barrel would overheat and could not be fired for long. The same was true for the guns. The barrels were already so hot that it was difficult to even reload. In addition, the stones, rolling logs, and other defensive supplies, because of the limited time they had, were being depleted at a rate visible to the naked eye. It seemed that they would not be able to last much longer. Xiao Gui had not expected the enemy to be so unafraid of death, completely disregarding casualties. They really are a group of desperados. Lord Commander has really given me a difficult problem. There's no other way. We can only fight with our lives on the line. Seeing that the situation was gradually worsening, Xiao Gui immediately ordered to stop throwing kerosene, stones, and other supplies, saving them for the critical moment. The artillery and firearms units also temporarily stopped firing, allowing the second unit to take over. This time, the firepower network weakened. The distant Cargill revealed a cruel smile when he saw this. And here I was wondering how valiant they would be, but it seems like they're only SOSO. Pass on the order, have the catapults follow up. Yes. Seeing that the defenders on the walls were weakening, Cargill decisively threw in the siege weapons. Catapults were pushed to the front lines, hurling giant boulders at the walls. Without the artillery to restrain them, the catapults became the ultimate weapon of the siege, unleashing a torrent of firepower on the walls. The already weak walls began to sway under the barrage of the catapults. Siege troops, follow up. Cargill ordered, dispatching his true trump card. He could already see the hope of taking Naga City in one battle, and his face couldn't help but turn somewhat red. Elite troops roared as they charged towards the city walls with siege ladders. The true battle had only just begun. Under the fierce bombardment of the catapults, the Dragon Stallion army did not bat an eyelid. The enemy's seemingly fierce attacks only caused some damage to the walls, but the damage to them was extremely limited. Seeing the enemy charge up the walls, the Dragon Stallion army soldiers revealed cruel smiles and pulled out the tank sabers at their waists, their eyes as cold as ice. They wanted to show the enemy what it meant to be the butchers of hell. Chapter 1177. The sunset glow illuminated the sky again. The siege that lasted for an entire day came to an end as night fell. Although the city walls were riddled with holes, they still stood tall. Corpses piled up like mountains at the foot of the city walls, and the blood-stained ground told of the strength of the Butcher of Hell. Cargill's bravery was just a counterpoint to the Dragon Stallion army's desire to kill. For an entire day, the Peacock Dynasty's army took turns to attack, but each time they were routed by the Dragon Stallion army. Especially after the artillery cooled down, the catapults suffered heavy losses. Without the cover of long-range firepower, the casualties of the Peacock Imperial Court's army increased exponentially. The Dragon Stallion army soldiers on the walls were truly like a group of butchers, efficiently and skillfully harvesting wave after wave of invading enemies. If he was tired, he would only need a rest for half an hour before he would be full of energy again. Under Bai Chi's training, the soldiers of the Dragon Stallion army had long since gotten used to high-intensity battles. Under the night sky, the ferocious-looking Carger led his troops away from the front lines. His back looked very lonely and desolate. This time, he had volunteered to fight, but Cargill didn't respond. According to the Peacock King's temperament, Cargill already had no chance of participating in the upcoming battle. In fact, he might even be given the cold shoulder in the army. When he returned to the tent, the other generals did not take pleasure in his misfortune. During the day, they had also watched the battle from the high ground. To be fair, Cargill had already done very well. Under such difficult circumstances, he had still managed to maintain the morale of the army. If it were them, it would probably be the same. It could only be said that the Dragon Stallion army truly lived up to its reputation. This was like pouring a bucket of cold water over them. As soon as Cargill returned, the Peacock King's military order arrived. Cargill was ineffective in battle and has betrayed the king's trust. Immediately remove him from his military post and detain him pending trial. During the entire process, Cargill didn't even get to see the Peacock King before he was taken away by the ice-cold guards. Although the other generals sympathized with him, no one would plead for mercy for Cargill. Not to mention the possibility of being reprimanded by the king. What if the king casually said, "Since you're pleading for Cargill, you can go tomorrow"? If that was the case, wouldn't it be terrible? After a day of observation, no one would think that attacking Naga City was a pleasant task. June 10th, the second day of the Battle of Naga City. The unlucky ones chosen by the Peacock King led a new round of attacks on Naga City. After a wave of consumption, the fierce attack of the Peacock Imperial Court's army on the second day finally had a trace of success. They attacked the top of the city wall one after another, and for a period of time, they had already taken down a whole section of the city wall. Unfortunately, the soldiers of the Dragon Stallion army were truly brave and fierce, each of them fighting with no regard for their own lives. After paying a heavy price, they were able to miraculously retake their position. Even so, by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the entire line of defense was on the verge of collapse. The cannons ran out of ammunition and completely stopped firing. This gave the Peacock Imperial Court the hope of breaking the city, but time was not on their side. Soon, night fell again, ending the fierce battle. Even so, the Peacock King was still overjoyed. Tomorrow, we must take down Naga City tomorrow. The Peacock King was both excited and anxious. A third of the kingdom wartime had already passed, and he couldn't wait any longer. Fortunately, as long as they took down one city, they would be able to form a chain reaction and rapidly expand their gains. In these 2 days, the Dragon Stallion army did not leave the city to fight, continuing to be a turtle hiding in its shell, allowing the Peacock King to attack Naga City in peace. Because the wilderness was already filled with the eyes of the Peacock Imperial Court, the moment the Dragon Stallion army left the city, the Peacock King would immediately know, eliminating any possibility of a sneak attack by the Dragon Stallion army. If the nearby Dragon Stallion army dared to leave the city as reinforcements, they would only be seeking their own deaths. But on this night, an unforeseen event occurred. On the city wall of Naga City, in the darkness of the night, Xiao Chaogui, accompanied by his personal guards, came to the city walls to inspect the situation of the patrols. Gazing at the faint lights of the enemy camp outside the city, Xiao Chaogui had a complex expression. After paying the sacrifice of 15,000 soldiers, the 5th Legion had finally completed the mission assigned to them by the command center. Will reinforcements arrive tomorrow? Xiao Chaogui gazed into the distance. Although the Great Xia did not have a second army in this region, and the idea of reinforcements was somewhat suspicious, Xiao Chaogui still deeply trusted the Lord Commander and would not make empty promises. Perhaps His Majesty is summoning the Imperial Guard. As a high-ranking general in the army, Xiao Chaogui still had some understanding of this matter. As he thought of this, Xiao Chaogui was filled with energy. The 5th Legion had been suppressed for 2 days. It was time for them to fight back to their heart's content. Otherwise, it would be too stifling. The night grew deeper and deeper. At the same time, in a monster's nest in the wilderness. The nest was only 15 kilometers from the encampment of the Peacock Imperial Court's army. The sporadic monsters that emerged were all taken care of by the scouts of the Peacock Imperial Court, and there was no so-called monster tide. In fact, just 5 days ago, there was already a group of Great Xia scouts quietly lurking in the vicinity of the monster nest, waiting for the arrival of the monster tide. After waiting bitterly for 5 days, things finally took a turn for the better. In the early hours of the 11th day, the calm nest suddenly emitted billowing black smoke. This was a precursor to the outbreak of the monster tide. The black smoke rose more than 30 meters into the air, indicating that this was a large monster tide. Such a strange scene immediately attracted the attention of the Great Xia scouts. "Hurry! Wake up! The monster tide is coming!" The soldiers on guard hurriedly woke up their companions. The captain woke up at the first moment, his spirits lifted, and he looked up at the black smoke in the distance, revealing an ecstatic expression. "The heavens are really helping us. This is an unprecedented monster tide. Hurry!" immediately informed the headquarters. As the captain spoke, he solemnly took out a talisman, which was the spirit guiding talisman that Bai Qi had given him. The talisman only needed to be used within 5 miles of the nest to be effective. Otherwise, no one would dare to use it. In Bai Qi's arrangement, because the time of the monster tide was uncertain, it could only be regarded as a surprise attack. Even Bai Qi did not know how effective this talisman would be. If there was no monster tide today, Ouyang Shua would summon the Imperial Guards of the Royal City to rescue Naga City. But the monster tide appeared on the last night. It can only be said that luck was really on the side of the Great Xia. It was no wonder that the captain was ecstatic. He knew too well how timely the monster tide would come. Without hesitation, the captain tore open the spirit-guiding talisman. With a swoosh, the talisman turned into a white light, like lightning, and was thrown towards the black smoke in the distance. The message arrived. As soon as the white light entered the black smoke, it was like a catalyst. The black pillar that was already surging with momentum, as if it had the help of God, with a swoosh, it instantly became taller and thicker. In the blink of an eye, it became a 300-meter-tall pillar that supported the sky. When the group of scouts saw this, they were so surprised that they could not close their mouths. Even though they were far away, they could feel the sharp killing intent and the bursts of beast roars that were emitted by the black pillar, which made their scalps go numb. "Oh my God! How many monsters are there? As scouts, they were active in the wilderness all year round and were not unfamiliar with monster nests, but they had never seen a black smoke that was more than 50 meters tall. A 300-meter-tall black smoke? Just the thought of it was scary. Soon, the black smoke dispersed like the wind, and ferocious monsters appeared. From afar, there were no less than 30 pterosaurs circling in the air. The entire surroundings of the monster nest had been flooded by the monster tide, and there was not a single living creature. "Quick, fire the signal flare." The captain suppressed his fear and quickly ordered. Yes, in the twinkling of an eye, there were several signal flares rising into the air, cutting through the dark night sky. The monster tide that had just appeared was worrying about not having a target to attack, but when they saw the signal flares rising into the air, it was like they had seen their prey. Without thinking, they rushed over. From far away, they could hear the vibration of the monster tide, like the earth was shaking and the mountains were shaking. "Get on the horse." Without the captain's order, the scouts quickly mounted their horses and quickly evacuated. Looking at the direction of their retreat, it was the location of the Peacock Imperial Court's army camp. This was called diverting the trouble to another person. In order not to let the monster tide lose their target, the scouts must fire several signal flares every once in a while. These signal flares were like guiding lights, leading the monster tide by the nose. During this period, they also encountered the night scouts of the Peacock Imperial Court, but in front of the vast monster tide, these scouts were like waves, quickly dissipating and did not cause the slightest ripple. The earth-shattering running and roaring of the monster tide completely broke the darkness of the night. In less than 2 hours, the monster tide came to the vicinity of the Peacock Imperial Court's army camp and was finally detected by the patrol troops on the periphery. Unfortunately, it was too late. At this time, the camp was quiet without the slightest noise. It was the time when the soldiers were sleeping soundly, and even the soldiers on night patrol were yawning, preparing to endure the last period of the night before dawn. When the alarm sounded, the camp exploded. In this case, if it was not handled well, not to mention the monsters attacking, the camp would immediately be in danger of being destroyed. This was not an alarmist talk. The military camp was an authentic place of killing. The traditional military law of China had the so-called 17 rules and 54 strikes. The soldiers lived in fear, and the mental depression that accumulated over the years could be imagined. In addition, the army had a strict hierarchy and closed management. Only the officers who were tyrannical and the soldiers who were ignorant could lead the army. Usually, they relied on military discipline to suppress the situation. Before the Great Battle, everyone's life and death were uncertain. They did not know if they could come back alive tomorrow. Everyone was on the verge of a mental breakdown. At this time, as long as there was a rustle in the wind, it could be just a soldier screaming in a nightmare, and it could ignite the hysterical atmosphere in the camp. The soldiers were completely free from the shackles of military discipline. Some people picked up their weapons and took revenge. They hunted down officers, enemies, and unknown comrades. The next day, only corpses were left. Under the pressure of the Peacock King, the military discipline of the Peacock Imperial Court was already abnormally strict. The soldiers were highly nervous, and in addition to the heavy losses in the 2 days of siege, the tension was even more aggravated. In particular, the Imperial Guards that were summoned had been constantly used as cannon fodder for the past 2 days, but there was nothing they could do. From the generals to the ordinary soldiers, they were all full of resentment towards the Peacock Imperial Court. Resentment rose to the sky. What was more coincidental was that, with the end of the battle during the day, everyone knew that the city would be breached tomorrow. Under such circumstances, the mood of the soldiers changed from a high degree of tension to a sudden relaxation. So this night, the soldiers slept particularly soundly. It was in this situation that the patrol troops suddenly gave an early warning, causing the camp to instantly fall into chaos. The eyes of the soldiers who were awakened suddenly turned red. The first to explode was the camp of the Imperial Guards of the capital. First, a certain camp was filled with resentment, blaming which bastard had sounded the alarm at this time. It was unknown who shouted that he wanted to teach the army of the Peacock Imperial Court a lesson. The speaker had no intention, but there were many who responded. Almost in a flash, a large number of soldiers responded, and from one camp, it rapidly expanded to 2, 4, and 10 camps. This resentment, like a virus, quickly spread throughout the camp. In the blink of an eye, the whole army screamed, like they had gone mad, charging towards the nearby camp of the Peacock Imperial Court. The soldiers of the Peacock Imperial Court did not know what was going on when they saw people charging over. Without saying a word, the two troops clashed together. The whole camp was in chaos. No one was able to sort out the sequence of events. The generals who tried to stand out to maintain order were instead killed by the soldiers, one by one dying without knowing why. It was at this moment that the terrifying beast tide suddenly arrived. For the army of the Peacock Imperial Court, this was simply a devastating disaster. Seeing the pterosaurs hovering in the air, the Tyrannosaurus beast that was like a tall building, the countless hunting dragon beasts, horned dragons, and some unknown monsters, the soldiers felt their scalp tingle and instantly sobered up. Heavens, where did so many monsters come from? The soldiers were dumbfounded. Looking around, there was no end to the beast tide. A rough estimate was that there were at least tens of thousands of beasts, or even more. They wanted to organize together to defend against the enemy, but it was too late. The sudden explosion of the camp instantly turned the camp into a mess. Corpses were scattered everywhere, and the eyes of the soldiers were bloodshot. Some were really crazy, and some were pretending to be crazy. No matter who it was, in the face of such a beast tide, they all seemed powerless. Run! After the initial shock, this was the subconscious reaction of the soldiers. Since they could not win, then they could only resign themselves to fate. The surviving soldiers, like a plate of loose sand, fled in all directions, disappearing into the vast night. Unfortunately, they had chosen the wrong opponent. If it was a normal battle between two armies, if they fled like this under the cover of the night, there would indeed be a large number of people who could escape and then slowly gather together to preserve some of their strength. But it was the monsters that had come. They marched in the night, which was basically no different from daytime. The countless food in the camp made the monsters more ferocious. Just by smell, they were able to track their prey. In the night, there were hunting scenes all over the mountains and plains. What made people's scalp tingle was that the hunter was the monster and the prey was the human. Mournful cries constantly pierced through the night sky. This was the most tragic beast tide attack in the history of the wilderness. Under the attack of tens of thousands of monsters, the Peacock Imperial Court's army suffered heavy losses. In one night, less than 3 out of 10 survived. After 2 days of siege, the 450,000-strong army had only lost 50,000 people, but in just one night, more than half of the remaining 400,000 soldiers had been eaten by the monsters. Even at dawn, the nightmare was not over. Whether it was the beast tide or the Peacock Imperial Court's army, after a night of pursuit, there were heavy casualties and were completely scattered. There was almost no organized team that could be found, scattered across the vast wilderness. Daybreak only served to intensify the fear in his heart. The monsters had no fear, and their goal was to constantly find new food. Even if there was only one left, they would never give up hunting. The only way to survive was to completely annihilate the monster tide. This was a cruel battlefield where only one could survive. No one was the true victor, and the real winner was the Dragon Stallion army hiding in the city. Chapter 1178. The 11th day of the 6th month, the battlefield of Hetao. The results of the beast tide exceeded everyone's expectations. When Xiao Chaogui reported the detailed information to the command center, even the cold and callous Bai Qi was dumbfounded. Isn't this too much of a coincidence? Bai Qi could hardly believe it. The beast tide came at the right time, and it just happened to cause chaos in the camp. This is truly unheard of. Ouyang Shua smiled. This is the death of the Peacock dynasty. General, if you do not take the gift of the heavens, you will be the one to blame. Ouyang Shua had never imagined that an unremarkable talisman would have such a miraculous effect. It seemed that bloody romance was truly the lucky star of the great Xia. Bai Qi cupped his fists and solemnly said, "This general understands. I will immediately arrange for the army to pursue the enemy and give them a heavy blow to avenge the previous robbery." "That's right." Ouyang Shuo was pleased. Bai Qi added, "I ask your majesty to lend this general a hand and summon the imperial army of the royal city to attack and catch the enemy unprepared. In order to not attract the attention of the great Zhou dynasty, it was naturally best to summon the imperial army as late as possible." But in Bai Qi's view, this was the best opportunity and could not be delayed. A little earlier was also a last resort. After all, with just the strength of the Dragon Stallion army, even if the Peacock dynasty suffered a heavy setback in the Beast Tide, there was still an organized army of 500,000 that the Dragon Stallion army could not contend with. At most, it would be a draw. If the 320,000 cavalry of the Great Han were added, the situation would be completely different. The Great Xia's military strength would be equal to the enemy's, and the Dragon Stallion army would be valiant against the Great Han cavalry. Ouyang Shuo did not hesitate to agree to Bai Qi's request. "Come, let's go outside the city." "Yes." Soon, the party arrived outside Pangbin City. At this time, the Peacock dynasty's army responsible for monitoring Pangbin City had already learned of the attack last night and was on high alert, ready to rescue the Peacock King at any time. Seeing the Dragon Stallion army stationed in Pangbin City leave the city, they did not dare to be negligent. Ouyang Shuo ignored them and quickly completed the summoning. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. A dazzling white light flashed in the outskirts of Pangbin City. When the white light dissipated, 320,000 strong cavalrymen appeared. It was an extremely shocking scene. The leader was an old general. He came to Ouyang Shuo with a complicated expression. He cupped his fists and said, "General Shangguan Jie of the Han Dynasty is ordered to bring reinforcements. I am at Emperor Xia's disposal." In order to allow the summoned Imperial Guards to quickly enter the battlefield without any unforeseen circumstances, Gaia stipulated that the summoned Imperial Guards would unconditionally carry out the summoner's orders without any reservations. Just like in the previous Battle of Niga City, even if the Peacock King deliberately used the Imperial Guards as cannon fodder, the Imperial Guards could do nothing but keep their resentment to themselves. It would only erupt under certain circumstances. When Ouyang Shuo saw that it wasn't Wei Qing, a trace of disappointment flashed in his eyes. He was familiar with history and had some understanding of Shangguan Jie. Shangguan Jie, courtesy named Xiao Shu, was a disciple of the Yulin Academy in his youth. He was renowned for his ability and had served as the Wei Yong's stable commander, grand servant, and attendant. When Emperor Wu of Han Lu Che was gravely ill, he was made the left general and given the title of Marquis of Anyang. Looking at his resume, although Shangguan Jie was the left general, he had no military experience and had always held a position in the court. For Emperor Wu of Han to send him to command the army, it was clear that he was very angry. After Emperor Zhao ascended the throne, Shangguan Jie had a good relationship with Huoguang. Shangguan Jie's son, Shangguanin, married Hua Guang's daughter, and the two families became in-laws. When Huoguang was away, Shangguan Jie would often take his place to handle government affairs. Later, because of the punishment of Shangguan Jie's son, Shangguanin, and the failure to obtain an official position for the eldest princess of Ai, Shangguan Jie and Huoguang's relationship became like fire and water. In the 9th month of the first year of the Yuanfeng era, Shangguan Jie joined forces with the imperial censor Sang Honyang and the prince of Yinlu Dan to hold a banquet to murder Huoguang. Not long after, Shangguan Jie and his son were killed. Ouyang Shuo noticed that Shangguan Jie's eyes were somewhat evasive. As smart as Ouyang Shuo was, he naturally understood the reason. Huoguang, who had a deep relationship with Shangguan Jie in history, was now serving in Great Xia as the governor of Liaojin. Comparing the two, it would be strange if Shangguan Jie's feelings weren't complicated. The reason why Ouyang Shuo remembered Shangguan Jie was not only because of his relationship with Huoguang, but also because of the legendary experience of Shangguan Jie's granddaughter, Empress Shangguan. Lady Shangguan entered the palace at the age of 6 and was crowned empress a month later. She was the youngest empress in the history of Huaxia. Emperor Zhao of Han was the youngest son of Emperor Wu. During the witchcraft disaster, Crown Prince Liu Ji committed suicide. Emperor Wu was disheartened and only appointed Emperor Zhao as the new crown prince before his death. After Emperor Wu's death, Emperor Zhao ascended the throne with the support of his officials at the age of 8. In 74 BC, Emperor Zhao, who had reigned for only 14 years, died of illness in Chang and at the age of 21. After that, under the leadership of Huguang and other officials, the Prince of Chang'e, Liu He, was adopted as Emperor Zhao's son. He was crowned crown prince and succeeded the throne. Lady Shangguan was crowned Empress Dowager. Liu He only reigned for 27 days before he was deposed as a commoner due to his excessive debauchery and failure to protect the country. He was known as the deposed Emperor of Han. After Liu He was deposed, Huguang presided over Liu Sun as Emperor Zhao's son. He became Emperor Xian of Han, and Lady Shangguan remained as Empress Dowager. Emperor Xian of Han, Liu Sun, was the grandson of Crown Prince Liu Ji, who committed suicide during the witchcraft disaster. He was raised in Yeding. History went round and round like this, as if returning to the starting point. Perhaps because of his painful childhood experiences, Emperor Xian of Han had the opportunity to understand the suffering of the people. During his reign, he worked hard to govern the country and selected the most capable and virtuous officials. The famous ones were the 11 meritorious officials of the Qilin Pavilion. Emperor Xian of Han was a famous virtuous emperor in the history of Huaxia. During his reign, the country's politics were clear, the society was harmonious, the economy was prosperous, and the 4 barbarians were obedient. It was known as the Shao Xian Revival. Historians said that the Western Han was the most powerful under his rule. In the Western Han dynasty, which was known for its strict naming of temples and posthumous titles, Liu Sun was one of the 4 emperors who had an official temple name. The other 3 were Emperor Gaozu Liu Bang, Emperor Wen of Han, and Emperor Wu of Han. In 49 BC, Emperor Xian of Han passed away, and Emperor Yuan of Han ascended the throne. The 40-year-old Empress Dowager Shangguan was honored as Empress Dowager until she passed away in 37 BC at the age of 52. Empress Shangguan was the second Empress Dowager to attend court affairs after Empress Liu. However, she was not the victor of the court struggle, nor was she the heroine who controlled the world. Instead, she was a small blade of grass that swayed with the wind. If she was disobedient, she could be deposed or killed at any time. She was widowed for 37 years. In terms of status, the Shangguan family had the honor that all women in the world yearned for, but could not obtain. It seemed that they had everything, but in fact they had nothing. Empress at the age of 6, Empress Dowager at the age of 15, and Empress Dowager at the age of 40. She had no children, and her adopted daughters-in-law and granddaughters-in-law filled the hall. But for her, her father, grandfather, and younger brother were killed when she was 8. She became a widow at the age of 15, and her mother was killed at the age of 24. Since then, she had lost all her blood relatives except her youngest aunt and the deposed Empress Qingyun. These things had worn away the happiness of her childhood, leaving her with nothing but bitterness and loneliness in the depths of the palace. In that palace, Empress Shangguan was tightly bound by something called the system until she died. After reading this history, Ouyang Shu also sighed with emotion. Now that he saw Shangguan Jie, the grandfather of Empress Shangguan, the main culprit who had sent Empress Shangguan into the palace, he felt as if time and space had changed. Ouyang Shuo was Ouyang Shuo after all. After a brief daze, he came back to his senses. After receiving the greeting, he stepped aside to give way to Bai Qi and said, "General Shangguan, just listen to General Bai Qi's arrangements." "Yes, sir." Shangguan Jie followed to pay his respects to Bai Qi, establishing a relationship of command. After the handover, Ouyang Shuo immediately returned to the city and handed over all the matters of the battlefield to Bai Qi. Immediately, Bai Qi issued a series of military orders in the name of the commander-in-chief of the front line. He ordered the Fifth Army to immediately leave the city and encircle the remnants of the Peacock King's army, striving to kill the Peacock King. Under the attack of the Beast Tide, there was not much left of the more than 400,000 soldiers of the Peacock Imperial Court. Moreover, they had been completely scattered. This was the best time to beat the Drowning Dogs. As long as the Fifth Army was properly deployed, they could completely wipe out the enemy. And given the ability of Commander Xiao Gui, he would not disappoint. The Fifth Army had suffered heavy losses, and the entire army must have long hated the Peacock Imperial Court's army to the bone. There was no need to worry about their morale. With such a perfect combination of time and place, once successful, it would be tantamount to cutting off one of the Peacock Imperial Court's arms. The remaining 4 armies of the Dragon Stallion Army, under the unified command of Bai Qi, cooperated with the 320,000-strong cavalry that Ouyang Shua had just summoned and launched a general attack against the Peacock Imperial Court's army. The first to suffer was the army of the Peacock Imperial Court stationed in Pangbin City. Under the command of Shangwan Jie, the 320,000-strong cavalry acted as the vanguard, pouncing towards the enemy like a wave. The moment the Peacock Imperial Court's army was summoned, their faces turned pale with fright. Without even thinking, they immediately broke camp and retreated. Unfortunately, no matter how fast they were, they could not outrun the galloping cavalry. The war began once more, and the situation of the Kingdom War was reversed. Huaxia District, Darkhan Dynasty, Luoyang. In the magnificent Weiyang Palace, on the ice-cold dragon throne, the middle-aged Emperor Wu of Han had an ashen face. His hands were like the claws of an eagle, tightly gripping the armrests on both sides of the dragon throne. His eyes were blood-red, as though he wanted to devour someone. They're going too far. They're going too far. As proud as Emperor Wu of Han was, he would never have thought that because of his pride, he would be unwilling to lower his head to the Great Xia dynasty and bring such disaster to the Great Xia dynasty. The moment the 320,000 Imperial Guards were teleported away, Emperor Wu of Han's heart turned cold. According to past practice, once the Imperial Guards were teleported away, less than 10% would be able to return. For the Darkhan dynasty, this was simply fatal. The revenge of the Great Xia dynasty was really ruthless and accurate. It made Emperor Wu of Han incomparably furious, but he was helpless. The Darkhan dynasty occupied the Central Plains, surrounded by powerful enemies. Once the Imperial Guards were not around, they would immediately be torn to pieces by the enemies. For the wilderness, this was an extremely normal thing. The only way out for the Darkhan dynasty was to surrender to a certain force to save their lives. But with Emperor Wu of Han's nature, even if he died, he would not surrender. Otherwise, Emperor Wu of Han would not have bowed to Ouyang Shua. At present, the news of the Imperial Guards being teleported away was still tightly sealed, but paper could not cover fire. Once the news spread, the Darkhan dynasty would most likely collapse without a fight. On the ice-cold dragon throne, the mighty ruler of a generation, Emperor Wu of Han, had a bleak expression on his face. 16th of June, the River Tao battlefield. In just a short 5 days, the Peacock Imperial Court's army was beaten back step by step, unable to withstand it all. Fortunately, the Peacock King had escaped and joined up with the main forces, and the situation was slightly stabilized. Even so, it was impossible to reverse the defeat. In order to exhaust the 320,000-strong cavalry on the battlefield, Bai Qi's attack was both resolute and ruthless. In the later stages of the war, he did not care about the sacrifices and must cause great damage to the Peacock Imperial Court's army. This group of madmen, under the relentless pursuit of the Great Xia, the Peacock King's face was ashen. He gritted his teeth and revealed his ruthless nature. He ordered the entire army to withdraw from the River Tao province, completely extinguishing his ambition for the River Tao province. This time, the Peacock King really suffered a double loss. Not to mention the heavy losses, he did not even manage to conquer a city before fleeing back to the country. After this battle, the prestige of the Peacock King in the Indian district was bound to be greatly reduced. The Gudho dynasty in the south received the news of the withdrawal of the Peacock Imperial Court's army and could not do anything under the siege of the Imperial Guards. Without saying a word, they quickly withdrew and quickly disappeared into the vast sea. If they were any slower, they would most likely be surrounded by the great Sia army. The Gudho King Akbar was worthy of being a senior member of the Azure Emblem. He was not very active in the attack and retreated quickly. Before the Indian Ocean Fleet came back to their senses, they had already returned to the Indian district. It was really admirable. With the withdrawal of the Gudho dynasty's army, the war initiated by the Indian district ended anticlimactic in the middle of June. When the results came out, everyone was taken aback. What was even more unexpected was yet to come. The Peacock Imperial Court's army wanted to withdraw, but the Great Sia did not agree. Taking advantage of the fact that the war was not over, they immediately arranged for the Great Han armored cavalry to pursue and kill their way into the territory of the Peacock Imperial Court, setting off a reign of terror. The host and the guest had changed hands. For the Great Sia, the Great Han armored cavalry was a suicide squad. They naturally had to make use of their remaining energy and sweep the borders of the Peacock Imperial Court, destroy their villages, and plunder their belongings as revenge. No matter what the Peacock Imperial Court does to us, we will return it double, Ouyang Shua said. The purpose of Ouyang Shua's action was naturally not just for revenge. First, it was to consume the Great Han armored cavalry and clear the obstacles for the next military operation in the Southeast War Zone. Second, it was to further destroy the Peacock Imperial Court's border, strike the confidence of the Peacock Imperial Court, and curb the rise of the Peacock Imperial Court. Only by hurting the Peacock Imperial Court would the Peacock King not have any other thoughts. Another point was that if the strength of the Peacock Imperial Court could be weakened and fall to the same level as the Gudho Imperial Court, then the competition in the Indian district would usher in a new variable. When the two tigers fought, they would no longer have the energy to fight against the Great Sia. In this way, the peace of the border of the Hetao province could be maintained to the greatest extent and win precious time for the Great Sia to solve the internal dangers. By the time the war ended, apart from the Imperial Guard that were summoned, the Peacock Imperial Court had lost at least 400,000 troops, which was equivalent to the complete annihilation of an army group, and the border had been reduced to ruins. Before the war, the Peacock King never thought that it would be such a result. Chapter 1179. In the Second Asian National War, apart from the dramatic reversal at the Hetao border, the overall situation was very calm and uneventful. Not to mention that there were no countries destroyed, there were very few large-scale wars. The root cause was that, apart from the significant decrease in player participation, the weak countries had already been destroyed, leaving behind strong countries with equal strength. The confrontation between the strong countries was not something that could be decided in a one-month national war. It was bound to be a protracted war. As for the national war between the Great Sia and the Peacock dynasty, the Peacock dynasty naturally suffered heavy casualties, while the Great Sia also suffered many losses. However, the biggest victim was the innocent Darkhan dynasty. It was the same for the Imperial Guards of the Indian district. Gaia's national war mechanism was seized by the lords and used unscrupulously. Ouyang Shua even exploited this loophole to the extreme, destroying the foundation of the Darkhan dynasty in one fell swoop. To the NPC dynasties, this was a little unfair. In view of this, as soon as the national war ended, Gaia announced that they would completely abolish the National War Month, cancel all protection mechanisms, and return the global wilderness to a chaotic situation. Of course, the peace in the Asian region could not hide the magnificence of the global battlefield. In just a month's time, under the joint control of the Silver Hand and the Azure Emblem, the territories were either merged, reorganized, or exchanged, causing a complete reshuffle among the global forces. The American continent. North America, the Maple Leaf Dynasty of the Canada region, swept through the crowd and established its position as the hegemon of the region. At the same time, in the gap between the Dawson dynasty and the Indian dynasty, a new dynasty rose, the Maya dynasty. It was the birthplace of the Maya civilization. Whether it was the Maple Leaf dynasty or the Maya dynasty, they all belonged to the Azure emblem. The Maple Leaf dynasty, the Dawson dynasty, the Maya dynasty, and the Indian Empire jointly divided the vast American continent. The four dynasties belonged to three camps, and it was quite chaotic. Under the pincer attack of the Maple Leaf dynasty and the Maya dynasty, the Dawson dynasty would not be as comfortable as before. The European continent, the Spanish region, and the Portuguese region merged to form the Spanish dynasty. The Lord of Tortosa, Casillas, became the king. The former Lord of Portugal, Pedro, suffered a crushing defeat in the competition and disappeared from the public eye. Pedro had the opportunity to pledge his allegiance to Great Sia, but because of his indecisiveness, he missed the opportunity. He didn't expect to be defeated in an internal struggle, which was really regrettable. The Spanish dynasty not only annexed the Portuguese region, but also took advantage of the foundation of Morocco to conquer Algeria in one fell swoop and connected it with Morocco. As a result, the Spanish dynasty became the first dynasty to cross the northern and southern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. For a period of time, it was extremely glorious, making the situation of the Great Sia dynasty's base city in the port of Gibraltar even more awkward. In the end, Algeria was just a supporting role, working for someone else. It was reported that in order to take down Algeria, in addition to the Spanish dynasty itself, the Silver Hand also played a key role in it. While roping in the Algerian lords, they created chaos in the capital. That was the reason why the Spanish Empire was able to succeed so easily. In addition to the Gaul dynasty, the Germanic dynasty, the Caesar dynasty, and the Ganger dynasty, the five dynasties took the opportunity of the war to completely divide up the entire European continent, leaving no room for negotiation. The traditional feudal lords of the Mediterranean Sea had completely become a thing of the past. Among the five dynasties in Europe, other than the Germanic dynasty, which belonged to the Azure emblem, the other four dynasties all belonged to the Silver Hand's camp, showing the huge influence of the Silver Hand in the European region. In terms of territory, the Germanic dynasty and the Caesar dynasty had the largest territory. Even so, Ouyang Shua wasn't optimistic about the Germanic dynasty. To the northwest of the dynasty was the Ganger dynasty, to the east was the Romanov dynasty, to the south was the Caesar dynasty, and to the southwest was the Gaul dynasty. With strong enemies on all sides, if it wasn't for the fact that the two major organizations hadn't shed all pretenses of cordiality, no one thought that the Germanic dynasty would be able to last until the end, unless a miracle happened. The African continent. Under the operation of the Azure emblem, the Egyptian region annexed Libya in the west and the Sultanate in the south, establishing the Egyptian dynasty in one fell swoop. It was also the first dynasty in the African continent. The establishment of the Egyptian dynasty immediately blocked the expansion of Great Sia in North Africa. When Ouyang Shua received the news, he couldn't help but hold his forehead and sigh. Great Sia's African strategy was really full of twists and turns. Fortunately, they had decisively taken down Ethiopia. Otherwise, Great Sia could only obediently withdraw from the African battlefield. Other than that, South Africa in the south also took the opportunity to integrate the surrounding countries and establish the Bantu dynasty in one fell swoop. At this point, the African continent was no longer chaotic. One in the south and one in the north, the two royal cities belonging to the Azure emblem's camp cooperated with each other from afar and had the momentum to sweep the entire African continent. It had to be said that in the operation of the neutral zone, the Azure emblem was more brilliant than the Silver Hand. The connections and resources they had, as well as the trust of the organization built by relying on the former Federation, were something that the Silver Hand couldn't compare to. Through this series of operations, the Azure emblem could be considered to have a firm foothold in America, Europe, and Africa. They gradually integrated the messy forces under their command together, and they had the strength to match their name. the chaotic global situation gradually became clear. Following the integration of the various continents, a large number of royal city forces disappeared and turned into new dynasty forces, glowing with vitality. In comparison, the Asian continents Huaxia and India seemed a little different. So far, there were still 5 major territories and a king city force in the Indian district, and there was no sign that they had merged with each other. In other words, this chaotic situation would continue for a period of time. The India region was also the only region in the world where the silver hand and the azure emblem coexisted. Needless to say, the situation in the Huaxia region was even more complicated than the India region, and the outcome would not be determined in a short period of time. Under the background of the global reshuffle of forces, this chaotic situation was very unique. Of course, with the end of this round of national war, the Great Xia was about to use force against the Dark Han dynasty, and with the start of the civil war in the Huaxia region, this incomparably chaotic situation would eventually return to one. It was only a matter of time. 30th June, Shanghai City. The great reshuffle of the global situation had undoubtedly attracted Ouyang Shua's attention, and it would inevitably have various effects on the Great Xia. However, it was ultimately something that he could not control at the moment, and the specific way to deal with it would be studied by the Secretariat. What Ouyang Shua had to do was to do what was in front of him. A day before the end of the national war, Ouyang Shua returned to the capital. The relevant post-war statistics had already been sorted out by the Privy Council, and it was placed on Ouyang Shua's desk for him to read. In this battle, Ouyang Shua obtained another 500,000 merit points. Because his noble title had been raised to the highest level, the merit points were automatically converted into achievement points by Gaia. A total of 500,000 merit points was just enough to materialize a Homo sapiens. Apart from the merit points, he also captured 180,000 prisoners of war, and a large portion of them were killed by the Great Han Dynasty's cavalry. Because of this, Ouyang Shua specially met Shangguan Jie to express his goodwill. After replenishing the losses and eliminating the wounded and unqualified soldiers, there were still 120,000 prisoners of war waiting to be reorganized. This batch of prisoners of war would be sent to the Great Jin dynasty as part of the trade between the Great Xia and the Great Jin. Ouyang Shua was in a hurry to return to Shanghai City, mainly to speed up the deployment of troops to attack the Great Han dynasty. This global reshuffle had the greatest impact on Ouyang Shua, and it made him subconsciously speed up the pace of the Huaxia region's annexation, so that he wouldn't miss the upcoming global war. A week ago, Han Xian had already led the Leopard Hidden Army to teleport to fallen Phoenix City. At the same time, to ensure that the battle with the Great Han Dynasty would be foolproof, Ouyang Shua had also transferred the 5th Legion of the City Guard stationed in the east of the city to assist in the battle, and they were placed under the command of Han Xian. At present, the Leopard Hidden Army had already finished gathering at the border, and they were ready to attack the Great Han Dynasty at any time. The Great Jin Dynasty was the one providing the Leopard Hidden Army with logistical supplies. In other words, the attack on the Great Han Dynasty could be considered as Great Xia and the Great Jin Dynasty working together. One was in charge of the battlefield, and the other was in charge of logistical supplies. The reward given by Great Xia was the 120,000 prisoners of war. Ouyang Shua did this because he had no other choice. Great Xia was not connected to the Great Han Dynasty, so he could only use a compromise. If this dragged on for too long, there would definitely be unforeseen events. In order to dispel Di Qin's ambition to intervene in this war, the brave Tiger Army and the newly formed Xiangjiang Army gathered at the border, except for the necessary troops to guard the monster nests. It was the same for the Northern Frontier Army in the north. The Great Jin Dynasty's Blazing Flame Army also gathered at the border to monitor every move in Handan City. Even the Soaring Eagle Army stationed in the north of Shu was ordered to move to the west, and they were deployed at the border of Jingshu Province, ready to attack the Great Zhou Dynasty at any time. Aside from the Great Zhou Dynasty, there was another force that had the strength to intervene in the war with the Great Han Dynasty, and it was Great Tang. However, considering that even if Great Tang took down the Great Han Dynasty, they would still have to face Great Xia's counterattack, and with Tang Taizong's character, he would not be so reckless. If Great Tang suffered losses in the process of attacking the Great Han Dynasty, they would become meat on the chopping board of Great Xia, and their efforts would be in vain for the Great Xia Dynasty. From this, it could be seen that Great Xia still had some deterrence in the Huaxia region. At the border of the Central Plains, at around 9 in the morning, the Leopard Army and the 5th Legion of the City Guards, a total of more than 400,000 soldiers, officially entered the Great Han Dynasty's territory under Han Xian's command. Han Xian's strategy was very simple. The vanguard would directly attack Luoyang without any hesitation. There were less than 200,000 Imperial Guards in the Great Han Dynasty, and they were mainly cavalry. They were not good at defending the city, and if they fought outside the city, the Great Xia army would be at a disadvantage. Instead of that, it was better to attack the city directly. They could besiege the city to attack the reinforcements, and they could also attack the vital points, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Once Luoyang City was breached, the Great Xia army would be able to reinforce the battlefield at any time, and it was guaranteed that nothing would go wrong. Following the uprising of the Great Xia army, after a long period of peace in the Huaxia region, a war finally broke out again. What no one expected was that this war would become the fuse of the Huaxia region's Great Chaotic War, which would start a year-long chaotic war in the Huaxia region, to the point where people were plunged into misery and suffering. The 2 sides of the chaotic war were Great Xia and the secretly established Six-Nation Alliance. Chapter 1180. When an unparalleled expert appeared in a place, an expert who could unify the universe, it would not attract the attention of the 4 seas, but would attract the combined forces of heroes to attack together. Just like the Qin state in the past, it fought against the 6 states alone. As the Great Xia ascended to the top position in the Huaxia region and conquered overseas, its momentum was unstoppable. Finally, it met the same fate as the Qin state. As early as 5 months ago, the Qin, Han, Tang, Song, Ming, Qing, and the Zhou dynasty, a total of 6 states, with the help of the Zhou dynasty, formed an alliance in order to resist the rise of the Great Xia. As the Great Xia took drastic measures against the Han state, it wanted to destroy the Han state as soon as the war ended, completely exposing the Great Xia's ambition to unify Huaxia. Finally, the 6 states took action. Gaia's cancellation of the summoning of the Imperial Guards gave the dynasties a reassurance. Thus, a loose anti-Xia alliance was formed. In order to facilitate the alliance of the 6 states, Di Qin put in a lot of effort and did not hesitate to offer a sky-high price. Among the 6 states, the Great Qing and the Great Xia had always been at odds with each other. Di Qin did not waste much effort to rope them in. The Song and the Ming dynasties, which were located within the borders of the Great Zhou dynasty, were the focus of Di Qin's efforts. In order to conquer the 2 states, Di Qin did not hesitate to cede the entire Jiangsu province, where Xiangyang was located, to the Great Song, and the entire Donghai province, where Jianya was located, to the Great Ming. The condition was that the 2 dynasties had to bear the heavy responsibility of defending the borders of the Great Zhou dynasty, so that the Great Zhou dynasty could take the opportunity to destroy the Great Jin when the Great Xia attacked the Han state. It could even be said that Di Qin was prepared to continue after conquering the Great Jin and take down the Han state in one fell swoop. Of course, before conquering the Great Jin, Di Qin would not reveal any of this to his allies. It was funny that the Han state was originally a member of the alliance of the 6 states. Now that its strength was damaged, it was immediately abandoned by Di Qin and became the prey of the Great Zhou dynasty. As the saying goes, it's easy to change mountains and rivers, but it's hard to change one's nature. If Di Qin's plan could be realized, then the Great Zhou dynasty would have to give up 2 provinces, gain 2 more provinces, and win 2 more allies. This was definitely not a bad deal. As for the northern frontier province, Di Qin generously promised it to the Great Qing. Great Qin and Great Tang's participation was mostly due to their apprehension of being in the same boat. They did not have a specific deal with the Great Zhou dynasty. They only agreed not to get involved in the war between the Great Zhou dynasty and the Great Jin dynasty. Qin Jin's kindness instantly vanished in a thin air. In the face of national interests, the alliance was just a piece of waste paper. It did not have any binding effect. Obviously, both Emperor Qin and Emperor Taizong of Tang did not wish for the Xia kingdom to continue expanding in the Huaxia region, constantly squeezing their living space and causing trouble in the future. Fortunately, the Qin Empire and the Tang Empire still remembered Great Xia's kindness. They only promised not to send reinforcements to Great Jin, but they would never confront Great Xia head-on. As for how to circumvent the restriction of the dynasties from taking the initiative to attack Great Xia, Di Chun had his own ways. On the 7th day of the 7th month, Han Xian led his troops and successfully took down 2 passes to the north of Luoyang. In just a week, Han Xian had broken through 2 checkpoints. It could be seen that Han Xian was a godly strategist. The kinship between Han Xian and the burly man had long since vanished into thin air in history. As one of the most magnificent cities in the world, Luoyang's defense was undeniably strong. This battle was also the first time that a lord of the Huaxia region had seriously attacked Royal City. If they won this battle, Han Xian would be famous throughout the world. If they lost, his reputation would be ruined. In view of this, Han Xian did not dare to be negligent. It seemed like he was marching quickly, but in fact he left behind strongholds along the way to ensure the safety of the grain route. When the army arrived outside the city, they also built their camp step by step. Before the camp was repaired, Han Xian had no plans to attack the city. The burly Han dynasty's response was also very rational. As early as when the imperial army was transferred away, Emperor Wu of Han had already realized the crisis and immediately ordered General Wei Qing to transfer all the imperial army scattered within the dynasty back to Luoyang. With a mere 200,000 imperial army, it was impossible to defend the vast territory of the Central Plains province. Instead of being defeated by the enemy one by one, it was better to join forces and fight to the death. Perhaps there would be a chance to turn things around. On the contrary, as the most magnificent city in the world, not only was Luoyang's defense stable, but it also had sufficient rations. It wouldn't be a problem to defend for more than a month. Near the end of the war, seeing that Great Xia was preparing for war, Emperor Wu of Han ordered the commoners of Luoyang to disperse and seek refuge in the surrounding counties so that Luoyang's rations wouldn't be depleted. Given the nature of the Great Xia army, it would be safer for the commoners to leave the city. As such, if Great Xia couldn't attack Luoyang immediately, it wouldn't be a problem for Luoyang to last for 2 to 3 months. Anything could happen in such a long period of time. Unfortunately, Emperor Wu of Han still underestimated Great Xia. In the following week, the battlefield in Luoyang was calm, and the Great Xia army had no intention of attacking the city. While building their camp step by step, they collected rations from the surrounding counties. Large amounts of rations were continuously transported to the front line, solving the army's worries. Han Xian wasn't a pedantic person. Although he wouldn't harm the commoners, he still had to collect rations. According to Han Xian's judgment, the battle in Luoyang was bound to be prolonged, and rations were the lifeline of the entire army. Naturally, he couldn't hand over all of this to Great Jin. In addition to waiting for rations, Han Xian was also waiting for a batch of secret weapons to arrive at the front line. It had been a long time since the P1 cannon was introduced. The industry department had made new progress and developed the second generation of cannons. Strictly speaking, the P2 cannon was bulkier than the P1 cannon. Correspondingly, the P1 cannon couldn't compare to the P2 cannon in terms of power and range. It was a weapon specially developed by the industry department for attacking cities. It could be said to be an important weapon of the nation. Back then, in order to promote the industrialization of the Great Jin dynasty, the industry department of Great Xia built 2 munitions factories in Great Jin so that they could make use of the abundant coal and iron ore resources in Hedong province. Unexpectedly, these two munitions factories played a key role in the Battle of Luoyang. As early as a month ago, the two munitions factories had been producing the P2 cannon day and night. They were then hoarded for use in the Battle of Luoyang. After Great Xia fully promoted industrialization, the transportation problem of the cannons was basically solved. With a steel frame and rubber tires, the cumbersome P2 cannon could be transported across the mountains and precipitous ridges to the front line. Han Xian was waiting for this batch of key weapons and equipment. For a majestic city like Luoyang, it would be impossible to fill it up no matter how many people there were. They would just be throwing their lives away. The only way was to use the cannons to forcefully destroy the city walls and fight their way into the city. On the 15th of July, the 200 P2 cannons finally arrived at the front line. Han Xian didn't hesitate. The next day, he led his troops out of the barracks and officially launched an attack on Luoyang. The attack method was very simple. It revolved around the P2 cannons. The 200 cannons were pushed to the front line. Under the protection of the army, they attacked the northern city wall of Luoyang. Boom, boom, boom. The cannonball drew a beautiful arc and smashed into the city wall like a meteor. As soon as it collided, there was a deafening explosion. Just a single cannonball was enough to cause stone fragments to fall from the sturdy city wall. Good. Han Xian's face lit up with joy when he saw this. The P2 cannon was indeed a siege weapon. Even though Luoyang's city wall was dozens of meters thick, it couldn't withstand the continuous bombardment. If there was no interference, it would only take 2 days to destroy one side of the city wall. Stay alert. Han Xian didn't let victory get to his head. At this moment, he was most worried that the Great Han army would take the initiative to leave the city and destroy the cannons. This was also the only way for the enemy to break the siege. With Han Xian's experience, how could he not guard against such a move? This was indeed the case. On top of the city wall, Wei Qing, who had been staying in the watchtower, realized that something was amiss when he saw the Great Xia army leave the barracks after a week of peace. He ordered the entire army to be on guard. When the 200 cannons were pushed out by the enemy, Wei Qing felt even more uneasy. The Great Han Dynasty's technological level naturally wouldn't remain at the level of the historical Han Dynasty. If that was the case, how could they be competitive? The top of Luoyang city wall was also densely packed with cannons, but they were all primitive versions. What made Wei Qing uneasy was that before the enemy cannons reached the firing range of the city wall, they would stop one by one and start reloading. Obviously, the enemy's cannons had a far greater range than the Great Han's cannons. When the cannons were fired in unison, Wei Qing's expression became even more solemn. As a godly general who was on par with Han Xian, Wei Qing naturally made the same judgment as Han Xian. He knew that if he didn't take immediate action to destroy the enemy cannons, Luoyang wouldn't be able to defend itself. Pass down my order. Get the 1st Division of the 1st Legion to get ready. As soon as they arrived, Wei Qing sent out his ace cavalry. Given the limited width of the city gate, sending out a cavalry division was already the limit. Any more, and the enemy would be able to take advantage of the time it took for the cavalry to pass through the city gate. If things went awry, the enemy might seize the opportunity to occupy the city gate before the city wall collapsed. Wei Qing naturally wouldn't make such a low-level mistake. However, could a cavalry division achieve Wei Qing's intentions? No one could say for sure. Chapter 1181. Han Xian issued a military order the moment the burly cavalry charged out of the city gates. In an instant, well-trained saber and shield troops rushed out from behind the artillery and formed a steel defensive wall in front of them. Mixed in between the saber and shield troops were spearmen and heavy swordsmen. Standing in front of the saber and shield troops were 2 rows of MO saber troops. At a glance, the MO saber troops were tall and burly, with an average height of more than 8 meters. Their muscles bulged, and they wore heavy armor. Their heads were covered by helmets, revealing only a pair of cold eyes. The mention of the MO saber troops was an existence that made the cavalry tremble in fear. The MO saber was a long saber used by the Tang infantry. It was developed from the Western Han Dynasty's horse slaying sword, and it also absorbed the Han Lu Mo saber and the Sixth Dynasty's long saber's shape and smelting technology. The Mo saber was extremely sharp and had excellent cutting effects. It was mainly used to kill enemy cavalry in war, and its tactical use was equivalent to an anti-tank weapon in modern warfare. After Gaia's update, the individual combat power of the soldier's sword. For example, the Leopard army, which had experienced hundreds of battles, when grouped together, emitted an awe-inspiring might even before they moved. With the increase in the combat power of the soldiers' weapons and equipment also ushered in a round of innovation. For example, although the MO saber troops were infantrymen and required a certain degree of flexibility, they could still wear heavy armor while wielding a heavy weapon like the MO saber. It did not affect their combat power at all. This was something that could not be achieved in history. Therefore, after the 6th round of updates ended, Ouyang Shu ordered the Combat Readiness Division to implement a new round of weapons and equipment update. Just the funds allocated for this was as high as 10 million gold coins. After the increase in combat power, the infantrymen who could only wear light armor could now wear heavy armor. The archers who could only wear leather armor could now wear light armor, such as chainmail. The soldiers' defensive ability was greatly improved. In addition, weapons like the Tang saber, spear, and heavy sword also ushered in a round of updates. Under the premise of an appropriate increase in weight, their lethality was greatly increased. It could even be said that the Combat Readiness Division also provided custom-made equipment services for squad leaders and above. Weapons and equipment were no longer limited to sabers, spears, and swords. Heavy hammers, meteor hammers, giant axes, and other weapons could all be customized. Moreover, with the continuous improvement of Great Xia's steel refining technology, the lethality of these weapons was comparable to divine weapons in ancient times. It was an existence that generals dreamed of. In the Great Xia army, it was gradually reduced to standard equipment. This was the reverse nurturing effect of the dynasty's economy and industrial development on the army, and the effect was remarkable. In the Southeast Asian battlefield, the Great Xia army had always been victorious, and one of the reasons was that they had superior weapons and equipment. After the sword and shield soldiers moved forward, the archers in chainmail armor followed closely, ready to shoot. There were also sword and shield soldiers guarding the perimeter. The cavalry on both flanks were also ready to go. At the rear of the army formation was an even larger reserve force that could be inserted at any time to support the front line. In the barracks, and even further around the army formation, were units of sentries. The purpose was to guard against enemies who suddenly attacked. With the military camp as the center, within a radius of 30 kilometers, there were scouts and sentry posts set up. Even the slightest movement on the periphery could be reported to the headquarters in time. In this way, the possibility of a surprise attack was minimized. The temporary granaries set up on both sides of the barracks were the focus of the army's defense. Even the Great Xia soldiers were not allowed to approach without a warrant. Otherwise, they would be killed. Between the granaries and the supply city of the Great Jin Dynasty was a meandering grain route. Along the way, 16 strongholds were set up for the grain transportation teams and the soldiers supervising the transportation of the grain. In addition, within the entire Zhongyuan province, cavalry units were dispatched to various cities to collect grain. Then, they recruited laborers and transported the grain to the granaries in the barracks. The Battle of Luoyang seemed like a simple siege battle, but under Han Xian's operation, it was actually a full-scale war. He used all available resources to guard against all possible accidents. It seemed like he was overly cautious, but in fact, this was the demeanor of a true divine general. To mobilize so many units, and to ensure that they were busy but not chaotic and coordinated, this was a test of the commander's ability to command. Without years of experience in the barracks, it was impossible to achieve this. Therefore, when it came to arranging the troops, Han Xian would not give the enemy the slightest opportunity. The entire formation was spread out around the cannons, and there was a balance between attack and defense. By the time the Great Han cavalry crossed the moat, the Great Xia's Mo saber and shield troops were already in formation. The archers were also in position and waiting for the order. The cavalry on both sides roared, and the war horses anxiously scratched the yellow soil. Fire! As soon as the Great Han cavalry's first platoon entered the firing range, the archer commander gave the order to fire. For a moment, a vast rain of arrows was thrown into the sky like fireworks, drawing beautiful arcs before falling straight down. As the rain of arrows fell, the Great Han cavalry was immediately thrown off their feet. At this critical moment, the valiance of the Great Han cavalry was undoubtedly revealed. In the face of the expected attack, the cavalry didn't even blink. While blocking the arrows with their shields, they still maintained high speed. When Han Xian saw this, a complicated look flashed in his eyes. After 2 rounds of arrows, the Great Han cavalry had already rushed to the front. Like a flood and ferocious beast, they howled and fiercely charged at the Mo saber soldiers with the spears in their hands and the iron hooves of their war horses. Slash! The Mo saber soldiers in the first platoon didn't even blink. Following the order, hundreds of long Mo sabers uniformly slashed down. It was as if they were beheading someone in a yamen, without any hesitation. The saber light flashed and blood spurted. It was like a slaughterhouse. Some of the horses' legs were chopped off, some of the war horses were directly cut into 2, and some of the more ferocious ones were even chopped off along with their horses. The scene was extremely bloody. There was a saying in the Great Xia army, if one isn't a villain, one shouldn't be an Mo saber soldier. Every Mo saber soldier was not only courageous, but they were also battle-hardened, bloodthirsty, and violent. They liked to use the most direct and bloody method to behead their enemies. Even the elite Great Han cavalry would fall under the butcher's knife of the Mo saber soldiers. In less than 10 minutes, 500 to 600 Great Han cavalry had their halberds sunk into the sand. More importantly, this wave of slaughter by the Mo saber soldiers had greatly shocked the enemy, boosted their morale, and delayed the enemy's attack rhythm. For the cavalry, once their rhythm was disrupted, the effect of their charge would be greatly reduced. After a successful attack, the Mo saber soldiers didn't choose to resist. They seemed to be clumsy, but they were as agile as monkeys. They shuttled freely between the war horses and retreated to the sides like a tide, leaving the position to the impatient Mo saber and shield soldiers. They would use the black iron shields in their hands to block the clanging hooves of the enemy. This was the ultimate contest between spears and shields. The Great Han cavalry was worthy of their trump card. After suffering a show of strength from the Mo saber soldiers, their courage didn't diminish. Facing the iron wall of Great Xia, the Mo saber and shield soldiers, they didn't show any fear and continued to launch a series of death charges. In less than an hour, they had broken through 3 lines of defense and were about to reach the artillery position. Once the Great Han cavalry got close to the artillery, it would be terrible. When Wei Qing saw this, the corner of his mouth curled up into a smile. This group of brats didn't disappoint me. In the entire world, it was already very rare for a cavalry to be able to exchange blows with the Mo saber soldiers. Furthermore, there were even fewer who could break through the defensive line of the Mo saber and shield soldiers. The Great Han cavalry was worthy of its illustrious reputation. However, at this moment, the 2 flanks of Great Xia's cavalry finally moved. With the heavy armored cavalry as the vanguard and the light cavalry providing cover from the periphery, they cooperated with each other and ruthlessly stabbed into the abdomen of the Great Han cavalry like 2 sharp knives, splitting them into 2. The collision between the cavalry was like the brandishing of long spears and biting cold blades. This was a confrontation between the strongest cavalry, and it was the most exciting scene in a cold weapon war. It was very beautiful, but also very cruel. The Great Han cavalry was cut in half at the waist, and the vanguard that had just broken through the defensive line was stopped by the MO saber and shield soldiers, unable to advance any further. The cavalry at the back was mercilessly harvested by the light cavalry of Great Xia. Under the repeated attacks of the Great Xia army, more than 10,000 Great Han cavalry suffered heavy casualties, but the results were minimal. Even if a few cavalrymen were lucky enough to break through the defensive line and arrive in front of the artillery position, they were easily dealt with by the archers at the rear. They were simply unable to cause any damage to the artillery. When Wei Qing saw this, although he looked calm, he unconsciously clenched his fists. The Great Han cavalry was the pride of the Great Han, but they were unable to shake the Great Xia army in the slightest. Even in the confrontation between the cavalry, the trump card of the Great Han cavalry was faintly at a disadvantage. This pride was ruthlessly smashed by the enemy. Retreat. Wei Qing knew that in the face of such an invulnerable enemy, a sneak attack was simply impossible to succeed. If this dragged on, it would only increase the number of casualties, and the enemy might even be able to use it against them. In terms of decisiveness, Wei Qing was not inferior to Han Xian. Boom, boom, boom. The war drums sounded, and the remaining Great Han cavalry didn't hesitate. They made a big detour and fought their way out of the encirclement with great difficulty. Like a receding tide, they quickly withdrew from the battlefield. Throughout the entire process, the roar of the P2 cannons didn't stop. The harassment tactics of the Great Han ended in a complete failure. Wei Qing was also decisive and stopped probing. He immediately ordered the construction of the fortifications in the city to prepare for a stormy battle with the enemy. For the next 2 days, outside Luoyang, the roar of the cannons was deafening. Inside Luoyang, it was also a busy scene. The commoners in the city were organized by the army to either demolish their houses, block the streets, or dig deep trenches. They had to turn Luoyang into a super military camp in the shortest time possible. In front of the Great Xiao army was definitely not a broad road. On the evening of July 17th, boom, accompanied by a deafening sound, the indestructible northern city wall of Luoyang collapsed with a loud rumble. Clouds of smoke and dust were swept up and shrouded the area within a radius of 100 meters. The smoke and dust were like a huge mushroom that rose into the sky and was very eye-catching. Luoyang had fallen. The Great Xia army outside the city cheered, and the commoners inside the city were frightened. When Wei Qing, who was inspecting the city's defenses, heard this, he only paused for a moment before continuing to patrol. His face didn't show anything, but his pace was obviously faster. The cruelest war is finally coming. Chapter 1182. Early in the morning on July 18th, Luoyang City. It had been drizzling since midnight the night before. By morning, the rain was getting heavier and heavier, turning the Great Xia campsite into a muddy mess. Han Xian had gathered the 6 commanders in the central tent and was having a routine morning meeting. Seeing the heavy rain outside the tent and the puddles on the ground, Wei Zhang, the commander of the Leopard Army's 1st Legion, asked, "Commander-in-Chief, it looks like the rain won't stop anytime soon. Are we still going to attack the city?" According to the plan, the 1st Legion would be the vanguard. Han Xian was also worried. After thinking for a while, he said, "The plan remains the same. Ever since we entered July, there has been continuous rain. It will be extremely difficult to wait for a sunny day. Let's attack the city today. We'll suffer, and so will the enemy." At this point, Han Xian glanced at Wei Zhang and asked, "Is there a problem?" Wei Zhang was still a little hesitant. After all, the rain was extremely disadvantageous for attacking the city. However, when he saw Han Xian's gaze, all his worries were thrown out the window. He quickly got up, patted his chest, and said, "Rest assured, Commander-in-Chief, the 1st Legion will definitely make a good start." "Then go and prepare." "Yes." Apart from the 1st Legion, the other legions were only responsible for guarding the perimeter and would not swarm into the city. This arrangement had 2 reasons. Firstly, the area of the city wall that had been blasted open was limited and could not accommodate too many troops. If they were to swarm in, the enemy might seize the opportunity and counterattack. Secondly, the command center could only understand the situation in Luoyang through the Mountain Sea Guard spies in the city. They had no way to investigate the situation in person. Because of the complex terrain, street battles were more dependent on intelligence. At present, the Mountain Sea Guard spies were working hard to find out where the Han army had set up their fortresses, where they had deployed their heavy troops, and how the entire defensive line was formed. Only by grasping this information would Han Xin give the order to attack. The First Legion's attack was firstly to probe the enemy, secondly, to take down a stronghold in the city and establish an outpost for the main force to enter the city. Thirdly, it was also to put pressure on the Han army. Wei Zhong had misgivings because of the heavy responsibility. Now that he had issued a military order, no matter how difficult it was, he had to start the first battle. Since it was a regular meeting, it naturally ended quickly. Han Xin's eyes flashed with a trace of worry as he watched the Legion commanders file out. He was worried about the abnormal weather. 6 years after entering Gaia, the weather had never been normal. April and May were the times when the seedlings needed water the most. However, there had been no rain for a long time. Farmers from different villages were willing to risk their lives for a little irrigation water. Fortunately, the water conservancy facilities in Great Xia were relatively complete. Finally, the rice paddies were able to head and no longer needed water. However, the weather was not favorable and heavy rains occurred frequently. When it rained, it would last for a week. Now that it was July, torrential rain continued to fall everywhere, and flooding was a disaster. Seeing that the rice had matured and was about to be harvested, if the weather didn't clear up soon, the rice that had been painstakingly cultivated for months would rot in the ground, and there would be no harvest. There was basically no difference between the spring wheat in the north and the paddy rice in the south. Apart from the Great Jin Dynasty supplying them with rations, Great Xia's expedition to the Great Han Dynasty was also taking advantage of the first season of rice harvest to collect rations on the spot. Who would have thought that after a few days of fine weather, there would be another downpour? Previously, the reason why the Great Xia cavalry was able to successfully collect rations from the Great Han Empire was because the commoners were eagerly anticipating the harvest. That was why they were happy to hand over the rations. If the heavy rain didn't stop, the rice would rot in the ground, and the consequences would be unimaginable. I hope the sky will clear up soon. During this attack on Luoyang, Han Xin wasn't worried about the front lines. He was only worried about logistics. 9 o'clock in the morning, at the camp of the First Corps of the Leopard Army. After confirming the military order, the soldiers of the First Corps began to move. Braving the heavy rain, they walked out of their tents and assembled at the drill ground before going into formation outside the camp in groups. The northern city wall that had collapsed yesterday had already been cleared by the engineers, forming a large gap that was more than 20 meters wide. Through the gap, they could vaguely see the fortifications that were stacked up with sandbags. Last night, Luoyang was also sleepless. Wearing the radiant armor, Wei Zhong rode a black warhorse and paced back and forth in front of the formation to boost morale. "My sons, the marshal has given us the first battle. That means that he trusts us. What will we use to repay him?" Wei Zhong roared. The surrounding raindrops trembled with the roar, emitting a pitter-patter. "Victory! Victory!" The 70,000 soldiers slapped their weapons and shouted, ignoring the heavy rain above their heads. "That's right, victory!" Wei Zhong waved his arm and shouted, raising his long saber. "Attack! Kill! Kill! Kill!" The 70,000 soldiers advanced boldly with divisions as units. At the same time, 200 P2 cannons were pushed out again and entered the artillery position. Their mission was to provide cover fire for the First Corps. Boom! 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 Just as the First Corps advanced, the cannons fired in unison and aimed at the top of the city wall on both sides of the gap, bombarding the cannons, arrow towers, and the defenders. Under the concentrated bombardment of the cannons, the top of the city wall was covered in thick smoke and plowed over and over again. When Wei Qing received the report, he lamented, The soldier celestial is indeed a soldier celestial. He really doesn't make any mistakes and doesn't give any chances. Pass the order for the defenders to withdraw. Yes, no one expected that the Great Xia army would still attack the city in such terrible weather and not give the Han army any time to prepare. If the Great Xia army didn't attack the city today, the Han army would have more time to perfect the fortifications. But now, it seemed like it was hopeless. While they were talking, the Leopard Guard's 1st Corps' 1st Division had already arrived near the moat. After a night of heavy rain, the river had risen sharply. Engineers, build the pontoon bridge. Archers, be on alert. The division commander was very experienced. As he gave the order, he kept a close eye on the other side of the river. In less than an hour, 5 simple wooden pontoon bridges were suspended above the moat and moved up and down with the river. During this process, the other side of the river was dead silent. Obviously, the Han army had no intention of rushing out to interfere with the Great Xia army. They were determined to hide behind the fortress. Charge! Without any hesitation, the division commander sent the spearmen as the vanguard to cross the river. After crossing the river, they reorganized their troops before crossing the messy gap and killing their way into the city. Because the gap was huge, the Han army couldn't fill it up even if they wanted to. The Han army simply set up their first line of defense with the gap as the center and the houses and streets as barriers. Just as the Great Xia army killed their way in, they were greeted by a rain of arrows. Archers, cover. Charge in. The division commander was very brave. He personally led his troops and braved the enemy's rain of arrows to kill their way into the position at the street entrance. As long as they took down the street entrance, they would be able to occupy the entire street and complete the mission given by the command center. The Han army hid behind a 1-meter-tall sandbag and constantly shot at the enemy. When the Great Xia army approached, the Han army jumped out of the fortress and started fighting with the Great Xia army. As soon as they came into contact, they used all their strength and put on a stance that they wouldn't stop until they killed their opponent. Both sides were first-class elites. When experts exchanged blows, there was no such thing as a warm-up. Either you die or I die. Very soon, with the street entrance as the center, scenes of life and death fighting took place. Blood was washed away by the torrential rain and flowed wantonly on the bluestone street. In less than an hour, the rainwater turned blood red. The Great Xia army attacked resolutely while the Han army defended tenaciously. Both sides fought for 2 hours around the street entrance, but there was still no clear winner. A small street actually blocked the path of the Great Xia army. Wei Zhang was anxious. He cursed and raised his saber. Personal guards, follow me. Yes, 2,000 personal guards followed Wei Zhang across the moat and killed their way into the city. The soldiers of the 1st Division, who were still fighting, were ashamed when they saw their commander personally charging at them. The commander wanted to commit suicide on the spot to apologize. Boys, let's go all out. If we don't take down the position, how can we face the marshal? Kill. The surviving soldiers of the 1st Division were red-eyed. Like wolves, tigers, and a group of evil spirits, they pounced on the enemy without any regard for their lives. The personal guards led by Wei Zhang were like a sharp sword that pierced into the hinterland of the enemy. In the face of such a bitingly cold offensive, the Han army finally couldn't hold on and was beaten back step by step. Upon seeing this, Wei Zhang decisively seized the opportunity and took the lead to cross the fortress and kill his way into the enemy's territory. The soldiers of the 1st Division saw this and followed closely behind. Once a gap was opened, it could no longer be defended. After nearly 3 hours of fierce fighting, the Great Xia army finally took down the street entrance and established an outpost position after paying a heavy price. The surviving soldiers were exhausted because the fighting was too intense. Ignoring the puddles on the ground, they sat on the ground and rested with their backs against the sandbags. However, their faces were filled with joy and pride. In this battle, they used the swords in their hands to defend the glory of the 1st Division. Everything was difficult at the beginning. After taking down the 1st street entrance, the subsequent attacks became easier. As the remaining divisions of the First Division entered the city one by one, they had already taken down an entire street by evening. The impregnable Luoyang city was breached. That night in Handan City, the Battle of Luoyang was closely watched by all parties. Because of the existence of the communication compass, it couldn't be hidden. Di Chun had been paying attention to the Battle of Luoyang and was constantly paying attention to the battle reports. Knowing that the Great Xia army had entered the city, Di Chun finally made up his mind. Summon General Lien Pe. Yes, sir. Soon, Lien Pe rushed to the imperial study. Di Chun didn't waste any time and said directly, "The time is ripe. Tomorrow, we will attack the Great Jin." Yes. Lien Pe's eyes flashed with excitement. This was the first time since the establishment of the Great Zhou dynasty, and the opponent was the Great Jin dynasty. This made Lien Pe, a veteran general, extremely excited. On the 19th day of the 7th month, just as the Battle of Luoyang was in a stalemate, the Great Zhou dynasty suddenly declared war on the Great Jin. The Great Zhou dynasty's imperial guards, Red Yang Army, Tyrant Army, and Red Blood Army, except for the necessary troops left behind to guard against the monster nests, the four main armies of the Great Zhou dynasty moved out together. The overwhelming Great Zhou army surged towards the Great Jin dynasty like a wave. Chapter 1183. The Great Zhou dynasty's declaration of war against the Great Jin was like a bolt of lightning streaking across the night sky of the Huaxiao region. Everyone realized that the old structure of the Huaxiao region had finally been completely broken. Let's fight. Since we can't avoid it, we might as well fight later. Without destruction, there can be no construction. It's about time for the Huaxiao region to give birth to an unparalleled king who can unify the universe. The Warring States period is no longer suitable for the global situation. The era is calling for the birth of a king. This time, there are fewer complaints from the players. Most of them chose to watch from the sidelines. Today was different from the past. The global landscape had undergone drastic changes. Mergers and reorganizations were about to come to an end, and an era of global hegemony had arrived. The Huaxia region was the first region of the game, and they could not fall behind others. When the war broke out, more than 90% of the players focused their attention on Shanghai City and the mysterious emperor who lived in the Xia Palace. They were eager to know how Great Xia would deal with this situation. Shanghai City, Xia Palace. As early as when Han Xian led his troops to attack the Han dynasty, the Mountain Sea Guards had sent news that the Great Zhou dynasty's army had been mobilized recently, and large amounts of war resources were gathering in Handan City. All the signs pointed to the fact that the Great Zhou dynasty was no longer willing to be left out and could start a war at any time. Previously, the Grand Council had judged that the Great Zhou dynasty's mobilization of troops was to prepare to intervene in the Great Han dynasty's battlefield. Unexpectedly, their real target was the Great Jin dynasty. Although Feng Xiuhuang was prepared, he was still caught off guard. Martial Heroic Hall. The Grand Council ministers by Qi and Sun Bin, the Military Affairs Minister Du Ruhui, the Chief Grand Secretary Zhang Liang, the Grand Secretary and Chief Strategist Jia Su, the Commander of the Shanghai Guards, Xin Buhai, and the Chief Military Intelligence Director Cobra were all present. Ouyang Shua sat upright in his seat and looked at Cobra. The Intelligence Department will first update us on the latest situation. Yes, sir. Cobra stepped forward. According to the joint investigation of the Mountain Ocean Guards and the Military Intelligence Department, the reason why the Great Zhou dynasty dared to send an entire army to attack the state of Jin is because of its cooperation with the other dynasties. The cooperation between the two intelligence agencies could be considered harmonious. At the very least, they did not openly fight for credit. To the north, the Great Qing's 200,000 imperial guards are stationed at the border between the northern frontier province and the capital province, guarding the north for the Great Zhou. Once the northern frontier army invades, the Great Qing will definitely not sit idly by. According to the rules, the various dynasties could not take the initiative to attack the Great Xia, but it did not mean that they could not assist their allies in guarding the borders. This allowed them to circumvent the rules set by Gaia. In the south, the Great Song's imperial army has left Xiangyang and is stationed at the border of Jiangsu province. The Great Ming's imperial army is also heading south. They are preparing to set up defenses around Huanan province and Jiangnan province to block our army's way north. In the west, Great Qin and Great Tang are temporarily biding their time. However, when King Jin asked for reinforcements from Great Qin, he was given the cold shoulder. It seems that Great Qin doesn't want to fulfill the treaty and won't send reinforcements to Great Qin. Emperor Han Wu of Qin, ancestor Song of the Tang sect. As expected, no one was willing to be manipulated by others. Ouyang Shua's thoughts were too simple. After Ouyang Shua heard this, he smiled faintly. Good. In the blink of an eye, those who can jump out have jumped out. What's going on? Are we really that feared? We haven't even made a move yet, and the people around us are already rushing to group up. At this point, Ouyang Shua couldn't help but laugh. Looking back at Great Xia's path of expansion, it was a bloody path that constantly broke through encirclement. In the beginning, there was the Lianzhou Basin's Lord Alliance, and in the middle, there was the City-State Alliance, and now there was the Six-Nation Alliance. Du Ruhui and the others also smiled when they heard this. Indeed, Great Xia had seen all sorts of storms along the way. Today's situation wasn't surprising at all. When Great Xia made the strategic decision to sweep through the Huaxia region, they had already anticipated this situation. Even so, Ouyang Shua was still a little curious. I want to know what conditions Great Zhou offered for the three dynasties to be willing to guard the borders for them. Since ancient times, one would not do anything without benefits. Ouyang Shua did not believe that Emperor Taizu of Song and the others were selfless. Shen Buhai stepped forward and replied, according to the intelligence obtained by the mountain sea guards, they should have promised a province of land for the dynasty's expansion. Of course, this information has yet to be confirmed. Ouyang Shua nodded approvingly. It was already very impressive that the mountain sea guards could obtain such confidential information so quickly. They did not waste the large amount of intelligence funds that were invested every year. This is like Di Chen style. He likes to paint a big picture for his allies. Ouyang Shua was deep in thought. Di Chen's move not only roped in the Song and Ming kingdoms, but also moved Lord Chunshan of Chu and Lord Zhang Lang of Qi away from their base. This strengthened his position in Great Zhou. It was killing two birds with one stone. He just did not know how Di Chen convinced the two of them. Shen Buhai continued, I have something else to add. According to the intelligence, the Mongols have been reorganizing their military. It seems that they are not willing to be left out. Oh, Ouyang Shua's eyes narrowed. He had always been wary of the Mongols and had never given up on monitoring them. What Ouyang Shua did not expect was that ever since Genghis Khan appeared in the wilderness, the Mongols have been very peaceful. In fact, they were even more peaceful than the Mongols. Even the usual harassment of the borders had been greatly reduced. Obviously, Genghis Khan did not want to provoke the Central Plains dynasty before the conditions were ripe. The fox's tail has finally been revealed. Ouyang Shua did not believe that Genghis Khan truly had no ambitions. His previous silence was most likely because he was quietly reorganizing his army and training his troops. Genghis Khan's style was not to attack, but once he did, he would strike a fatal blow. Have you found out the Mongols' target? The vast gold province bordered the Mongols, and Ouyang Shua was worried that it would become a target. If that really was the case, it would be disastrous. According to the intelligence gathered by the mountain sea guards, their target should be the Western Turkic Khaganate in the west. Ouyang Shua asked, this matter is extremely important. Is the intelligence department confident? Your Majesty, this intelligence was obtained by a snake guard from a Mongol noble. They are 70% confident, Shen Buhai said confidently. Before Genghis Khan had appeared in the wilderness, Ouyang Shua had ordered the intelligence department to strengthen their infiltration of the Mongol tribes. It now seemed that this was a good move. The snake guard that Shen Buhai spoke of was probably a woman who had given herself to a Mongol noble. They were very reliable. Ouyang Shuan nodded, temporarily putting his mind at ease. Now that he thought about it, the Mongols' choice was very easy to understand. The Western Turkic Khaganate and the Mongols shared a deep relationship, and their culture and system were the same. The Mongols would quickly digest the Western Turkic Khaganate, and there would be no problem of indigestion. There was also another reason. Genghis Khan clearly did not want to draw the flames of war to himself, so he did not attack the vast gold province. On the other hand, taking advantage of the chaos in the Central Plains and the inability of the Mongols to intervene in the war on the steppe to annex the Western Turkic Khaganate was a brilliant move. Genghis Khan truly was Genghis Khan. Whether it was his previous patience or his decisive attack, he had left a deep impression on everyone. If the Mongols annexed the Western Turkic Khaganate, their strength would definitely increase, and they would truly be a disaster. With the Mongol strategy, the vast gold province will be the first to bear the brunt of the Western Turkic Khaganate's invasion. What was frustrating was that the Great Xia did not have the energy to intervene. Inform our spies and the Mongols to delay them as long as possible. This was the only feasible plan for the Great Xia. Yes, Shin Buhai replied. No. Ouyang Shua paused, suddenly thinking of something. He turned to Shin Buhai and said, "Cancel the order just now. Have our spies continue to hide and not expose themselves." Yes. With Shun Buhai's intelligence, he immediately understood the crux of the matter. His Majesty was prepared to cut his losses. He would rather not intervene than protect the spies that he had painstakingly planted so that they would not be exposed, so that they could play a crucial role in the future war between the Great Xia and the Mongols. After the report from the intelligence department, Ouyang Shual was preparing to consult the other officials on how to deal with the current situation when a report came in from outside. Reporting to Your Majesty, envoys from the Great Qin and the Great Tang have arrived. It was truly strange for two countries to send envoys at such a sensitive time. Why have they come? Ouyang Shual asked. The official from the Chamberlain of Dependencies replied, "They have come to offer the 9 province cauldrons." The hall fell into silence. After a long while, Ouyang Shual sighed. "They want to draw a clear line between us." The Great Qin and the Great Tang had only been able to occupy half of the province because of the assistance of the Great Xia, but the prerequisite was that they had formed an alliance. The flames of war had ignited in the Central Plains, but the two countries had been unable to fulfill their promise. Whether it was out of guilt or because they did not want to take advantage of the Great Xia, at this crucial moment, Qin Shi Huang and Tang Taizong had come to a surprising consensus. They had unconditionally handed over the 9 province cauldrons that they had been unwilling to hand over to the Great Xia. Henceforth, they would be even. Chapter 1184. The envoys from Qin and Tang were just a brief interlude. Ouyang Shual quickly composed himself. There are only 2 paths before us. Either we teleport the army to Luo Feng City and help the Great Jin defend against the enemy, or we directly wage war against the Great Zhou and open up a path to the Central Plains province. How should I choose? Minister, please advise. Jia Su stepped forward and said, "I do not agree with reinforcing the Great Jin dynasty." Reason: rations. Jia Su went straight to the crux of the problem. The Great Jin dynasty only has 1 province. The East River province is not a major grain-producing province, so its rations reserves are limited. In addition to supporting the logistics of the Leopard Tau army, they also have to support the Great Jin's Blazing Flame army and Imperial Guards. The rations are basically at their limits. To repel the Great Zhou army, a conservative estimate would require the imperial government to send at least 500,000 troops. If the war is unfavorable and drags on, the consequences will be unimaginable once a food crisis erupts. If I were the Great Zhou, I would definitely use delaying tactics and use their advantage in rations to engage in a prolonged stalemate with our army, so as to reap the benefits. Also, the entire wilderness is currently experiencing a downpour with no signs of stopping. It is already a foreseeable fact that the first season's rice and wheat production has plummeted. Based on the above points, I do not agree with reinforcing the Great Qing. Ouyang Shuo fell silent. He never expected that the first to fall victim to Gaia's 6-year food crisis would be the Great Xia, who was the most prepared. The Great Xia had massive amounts of rations, but they were unable to transport them to the battlefield. In the middle were the enemies of the Great Xia. In that case, we can only attack forcefully. Ouyang Shuo readily accepted the advice. South or north? Attacking forcefully was also called besieging Wei to save Zhao. Jia Su replied, "Tactically, the north and south have their advantages and disadvantages. If we attack from the north, once we take down the Great Qing, we can directly threaten the Great Zhou, capital, Handan, and force the Great Zhou to retreat. If we attack from the south, we will face the combined forces of the Great Song and Great Ming. The advantage is that if we attack from the south, be it troop deployment or rations guarantee, it will be very smooth. And once we break through the southern defense line and attack the Central Plains province, not only can we rendezvous with the Leopard Tau army, we can also establish a rations transportation route to the Great Qing." To put it simply, the northern strategy was simple. It was a true besiegement to besiegement. The tactics in the south were complicated and difficult to implement, but the rewards were great. Once the rations transportation route was opened, Great Xia could use this opportunity to wage an all-out war with Great Zhou, or rather, the Six Nations Alliance. This war would determine the new structure of Huaxia. From Jiadi's words, it wasn't hard to tell that he was leaning towards the south. The problem was, did Great Xia have the power to deal with both Great Song and Great Ming at the same time? In order to deal with the 1,000,000 imperial guards before the fall of the Great Jin dynasty, Great Xia had to mobilize at least 5 million soldiers. Was Great Xia ready for this? Ouyang Shuo didn't rush to a conclusion. He looked at Zhang Liang and said, "Zifang, tell me your opinion." In terms of strategy, Ouyang Shuo trusted Zhang Liang more. Zhang Liang did not decline. He and Jia were in charge of different levels of consultation, so there was no problem of competition. Your humble servant is thinking, if the Great Zhou dynasty is unable to take down the Great Jin dynasty this time, how will it fulfill its promise to the Song and Ming kingdoms? Ouyang Shuo's eyes lit up. He followed Zhang Liang's train of thought and said, "With Di Qin's character, he will most likely act shamelessly. But with the strength of the Song and Ming dynasties, it won't be easy to play around." "Your Majesty is wise." Zhang Liang complimented Ouyang Shuo before saying, "The matter in the south should be delayed rather than rushed. If we force the enemy into a corner, it will only cause the already unstable alliance of the 6 countries to become even more tightly united. The matter in the north should be rushed rather than delayed. If the Mongols suddenly end their hibernation, a Western Turkic Khaganate might not be enough to satisfy Genghis Khan's appetite. A war could break out in the vast gold province at any time. If we don't completely deal with the Great Qing dynasty before the Mongols make their move, the northern border will be in an extremely difficult situation. It will become a hot potato for the imperial court." Zhang Liang's words shocked all the officials present. Only now did they realize that if Great Xia wanted to unify China, not only would they have to face a large number of enemies, they would also have the strength to contend against Great Xia. When facing a group of enemies, they could not afford to be careless. Originally, when Jiasu was analyzing the pros and cons of the north and south, Bai Qi, Sun Bin, and the other generals were leaning towards the southern battlefield. They had long been looking forward to the decisive battle with the Great Zhou dynasty. Now that they thought about it, the matter was not so simple. There is another benefit to dealing with the Great Qing, and that is to obtain the 9 province cauldrons in the capital. Together with the estimated 9 province cauldrons in Luoyang and Chengdu, the day when the 9 province cauldrons will gather is not far away, Zhang Liang added. When Zhang Liang finished speaking, Sun Bin said, "Pavilion Elder Zhang's words are reasonable, but this general has a worry." "Speak." "Without reinforcements, How long can the Great Jin last against the Great Zhou army? Once war breaks out, can the Great Jin guarantee the rations of the Leopard army? If their rations are cut off, what will happen to the Battle of Luoyang? What will happen to the Leopard army? As the second in command of the Southeast War Zone, Sun Bin had to consider the interests of the war zone. Attacking the Great Han was a mission that the Southeast War Zone had accepted. If it was messed up, it would be a humiliation for the entire Southeast War Zone. This was something that Sun Bin did not wish to see. Now that the war zone's commander-in-chief, Han Xian, was fighting on the front lines, Sun Bin had to take responsibility. This truly is a problem. This time, Ouyang Shua did not seek the opinion of any of the ministers and said straightforwardly, "When enemies meet on a narrow path, the brave will win." Now that the war has developed to this point, we cannot be afraid of the slightest thing. We must bring out the spirit of conquering the world. Since rations are limited, the Battle of Luoyang cannot be dragged on. We must think of a way to end it as soon as possible. Wenhe, think of a way to end the Battle of the Leopard Army quickly. Ouyang Shua called out Jiasu's name. Ouyang Shua's improvisation was truly a test of a strategist's ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Without some ability, one would be rendered speechless by Ouyang Shua's questions. Fortunately, Jiasu was a top-notch strategist. As a strategist, his foundation was not only reflected in the imperial court memorials. In this aspect, a strategist and an actor were very similar, and that was 10 minutes on stage is 10 years of work off stage. How to put it? Take Jiasu as an example. As the #1 strategist in the army, he might not personally participate in every military operation of the Great Xia, but he would definitely follow the entire process and make use of the intelligence agency's information to do his homework. His goal was to have an accurate grasp of the overall situation and constantly deduce the battle situation, simulating countermeasures so that he could either actively or passively propose them for the emperor to make a decision. This was the role of a strategist. It was not something that could only be improvised on the spot when it came to the imperial court. No matter how formidable a person was, it was impossible for him to come up with an accurate strategy without understanding the situation at the front lines. That was nonsense, and it was impossible for it to appear in reality. Just like Zhuge Liang in The Romance of China, he seemed to be living in seclusion, but in reality, he had a clear view of the situation in the world. Otherwise, how could he come up with a highly constructive Longzhong couplet? Thus, Jiasu wasn't nervous in the slightest when faced with the emperor's question. He sorted out his thoughts and replied, "If we use conventional tactics in the street battle of Luoyang, it will definitely take a long time. The rations crisis will indeed erupt like what General Sun Bin has proposed." When Sun Bin heard this, he looked at Jiasu gratefully. If we want to resolve it quickly, we can only use unconventional tactics. Given Luoyang's conditions, we can use assassination tactics. If either Emperor Wu of Han or Wei Qing dies, the Han army will definitely fall into chaos. We can either burn down the granaries in Luoyang and cause the morale of the Han army to collapse, or we can start a massacre and spread fear, causing Luoyang to fall into chaos. Or we can use poison. It's currently the rainy season, and it's possible to use the rain. Jiasu's strategies made all the officials' scalps go numb. Poison warriors were indeed poison warriors, and they could come up with all sorts of vicious tactics. But thinking about it, given Great Xia's image in China, there were some tactics that couldn't be carried out. For example, Great Xia definitely wouldn't carry out a massacre or poison. As for burning down the granaries, given Wei Qing's cautiousness, he would definitely guard the granaries tightly. Even if the Mountain Sea Guard had many spies in Luoyang, there was no chance of success. Or rather, the chances of success were next to none. Eliminating all the other options, only assassination seemed feasible, but that was also the most difficult tactic. There was no need to mention Emperor Wu of Han. He lived in the imperial palace and was heavily guarded. Not to mention assassination, they probably wouldn't even be able to meet him. As a commander of the Han army, Wei Qing would always have his personal guards by his side, and it would be extremely difficult to assassinate him. No matter how they thought about it, there was no chance of success. While the ministers were worrying, Ouyang Shua seemed to be deep in thought. He thought of a business partner. It was the super guild that had betrayed Great Xiao once, listening to the Rain Pavilion. It was also the only guild that remained in the capital. Coincidentally, the Rain Listening Tower was stationed in Luoyang. Thinking of this, Ouyang Shua said, "Let me make arrangements for Luoyang later. Right now, we should discuss which troops to send to the north to attack the Qing army." Although the Qing army had only sent 200,000 imperial guards to guard the borders of Luoyang, they had to uproot the entire Qing army if they wanted to threaten Handan City. Otherwise, Jingdu would be like a nail that was hammered into the Great Xia army's path. It could cut off the Great Xia army supply route at any time. If they wanted to threaten Handan City, Jingdu was a hurdle that couldn't be avoided. Furthermore, Ouyang Shua wanted to use this opportunity to destroy the Qing army in one fell swoop and establish a new structure in the northern borders. Chapter 1185. After nearly an hour of discussion, the name list of the Purgatory Army was quickly finalized. Ouyang Shua set down two principles. The first was that the Imperial Guard and the Dragon Stallion Army, which had already been engaged in continuous battles, would no longer participate in the war against the Qing. Instead, they were taking this opportunity to rest and reorganize in preparation for the next major battle. Secondly, except for the border guards of the northern region, the border guards of the other regions would not participate in the war against the Qing. After setting the general principle, there weren't many choices left. The 4th and 5th Corps of a Northern Frontier Army had to guard the vast gold province to prevent the Mongolians from launching a surprise attack, so they could not be mobilized. The 3rd Army guarded the monster nests in Northern Frontier Province, and they were only in charge of supervising the transportation of food in the country. Only the 1st and 2nd Legions were sent out. The 2nd Army of the Yingzhou Army stayed behind to oversee the Yingzhou Province, while the 1st Army set off. The city guards, who had not participated much in the battle before, would be mobilizing the 2nd, 4th, and 5th Legions at once. The 2nd Corps guarded Mulan Fortress, while the 4th Corps guarded North Sea City. They rarely had the opportunity to participate in the war. If the army does not fight for a long time, problems will arise. The defense of the capital city, left behind by the city guards, was temporarily taken over by the Imperial Guards who had returned to Shanghai City. Similarly, the soaring Eagle Army, which was stationed in the Shu region, had rarely participated in battles since its establishment. This time, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Legions were dispatched, led by Commander Li Mu himself. Then there was the 1st and 2nd Legions of the Flying Bear Army. Firstly, the Alliance Army needed a commander-in-chief. Han Xian was in Luoyang, and Bai Qi was resting. Li Jing was the only candidate. Secondly, the Flying Bear Army also needed to train. After the reorganization, the Allied forces included the Southwest War Zone, the Zhili Army, and the Northern Frontier Border Defense Army. They also included 4 corps and 1 corps. In total, they had 11 corps and 770,000 soldiers. Just the mobilization work alone would take up to a week. In terms of logistical support, besides using the strategic grain reserves placed in the Northern Protector headquarters, they would also be sending provisions from the 3 coastal provinces of southern Chuan, Lingnan, and Minnan to the north. The Binhai Fleet and the Cliff Mountain Fleet were responsible for the security of the sea supply route. After finalizing the battle plan, the Grand Council and the Privy Council immediately moved to prepare for war in the shortest amount of time possible. The spies of the Mountain Sea Guards and the Military Intelligence Department would take action as soon as the meeting was over. The war machine of Great Xia rumbled once again. After concluding the military conference, Ouyang Shua returned to the imperial study. As soon as he sat down, Ouyang Shua made a video call to Feng Qiuhuang. Feng Qiuhuang appeared on the screen with a calm expression, but she couldn't hide the exhaustion between her brows. As the battle erupted, an overwhelming pressure pressed down on Feng Qiuhuang's shoulders. Unlike Great Xia, since the establishment of the Great Jin Dynasty's territory, Apart from the initial internal strife within the clan, it had been developing smoothly due to its geographical location and had not encountered any twists and turns. The battles they participated in were mainly based on military maps and nation wars. Now that Feng Qiuhuang was suddenly facing the threat of annihilation, it was easy to imagine the pressure that Feng Qiuhuang had to endure. Fortunately, the Great Jin dynasty's reputation in recent years was not undeserved. There were famous generals like Guizi, Ran Min, Meng Tian, Wang Xiai, and Zhou Bo in the army. Guizi was in command of the full Blazing Flame army, while Meng Tian was in command of the newly formed Imperial Guards with only 4 corps. The two of them were regarded as the twin pillars of the Great Jin army. The valiant General Ran Min was appointed as the commander of Feng Qiuhuang's personal guards, responsible for Feng Qiuhuang's safety. Ouyang Shuo didn't beat around the bush and reported the Great Xia's military deployment to Feng Qiuhuang before saying, "Defend for a month, and the Great Jin dynasty's encirclement will be broken. Can you hold on?" Feng Qiuhuang's eyes flashed with a trace of complexity. All along, the Great Jin dynasty owed the Great Xia too much. Now that they needed the Great Xia dynasty's help, no matter how one looked at it, she couldn't be considered as a qualified ally. At this moment, Feng Qiuhuang secretly made up her mind. "Ouyang, I won't say any words of gratitude. After the war ends, I will definitely give you an explanation for the Great Xia's grace." Feng Qiuhuang said seriously. Ouyang Shuo waved his hand. "Why are you thanking me? We are allies." He didn't delve into the deeper meaning behind Feng Qiuhuang's words. Feng Qiuhuang took a deep look at Ouyang Shuo and didn't say anything else. She changed the topic and talked about another matter. She found it a little difficult to talk about this matter, but she had to say it. "Regarding the rations, I'm not afraid of you laughing at me. The weather this year was too abnormal and the rations were not harvested. Our rations are running out. If we were to supply the Leopard Army, the Great Jin dynasty's rations wouldn't last more than a month and a half. As the saying went, those who forget to fight will be in danger." Unlike the Great Xia dynasty, the Great Jin dynasty had been at peace for too long. The War Preparedness Office didn't have the habit of storing a large amount of rations. They would usually wait until the new season's rations were harvested before storing a little. There wasn't much left of the rations that had been stored last season. Feng Qiuhuang said that they could last for a month and a half, and that was under the premise of using disaster relief rations and collecting rations from the people. Otherwise, they wouldn't even be able to last for a month. Ouyang Shuo was mentally prepared and said with understanding, "I have also predicted your difficulties. Although we can't send rations over, you can cut off the rations of the Leopard Army." "How can we do that?" Feng Qiuhuang shook his head. "Providing rations to the Leopard Army is a promise made by the Great Jin dynasty. We will never go back on our word. We would rather starve ourselves than guarantee the rations of the Leopard Army. I'm not complaining or burning the bridge after crossing it. I'm just reminding you that if the war drags on, I'm afraid we won't be able to hold on," Feng Qiuhuang explained. "I know," Ouyang Shuo smiled. "If nothing goes wrong, the Battle of Luoyang will end very soon. With the rations we have now and some local rations, it should be enough. The Great Zhou dynasty is coming at us ferociously this time, so you must not be careless. Don't fall for rations. Don't lie to me." Feng Qiuhuang wasn't easy to fool. Luoyang is a royal city after all. How can it be taken down so easily? Ouyang Shuo didn't explain much as he had to put Feng Qiuhuang at ease. He smiled. "Do I look like someone who cares about face? Just wait for the good news." Feng Qiuhuang looked at Ouyang Shuo hesitantly and finally nodded. To be honest, the Great Jin dynasty was indeed short on rations. Once Luofeng City was surrounded, they wouldn't be able to hold on without sufficient rations. If they didn't have to provide rations to the Leopard Army, the pressure would be greatly reduced. Although it was a little selfish to say this, it was also a helpless move. Following that, the two of them reported their respective situations and hung up the video call. Both of them were busy people and had a lot of things to handle. Especially Feng Qiuhuang, he was so busy that his feet couldn't even touch the ground. The Great Zhou dynasty had plotted for a long time and launched a thunderous attack right from the start. They pointed their vanguard at Luofeng City with the aim of cutting off the possibility of Great Xia's reinforcements. They were prepared to trap the Great Jin dynasty alive. From the border, the two armies started fighting, and the situation was tragic. Regardless of the outcome of the battle, the Great Jin dynasty, as the main battlefield, would definitely be covered in wounds after the battle. After hanging up the video call with Feng Qiuhuang, Ouyang Shua didn't hesitate. He found the tower master of Tingyu Tower, Sword Qi Lei Yinin, and initiated a video call. Before the official break, Sword Qi Lei Yinin was the Great Xia dynasty's ally. Naturally, he was also Ouyang Shua's good friend. When Gaia launched the communication compass, his previous good friend was automatically transferred over. Otherwise, even if Ouyang Shua wanted to find Sword Qi Lei Yinin, he might not be able to find it. In less than 10 seconds, Sword Qi Lei Yinin agreed to the call request and appeared in the video call. Emperor Xia? Sword Qi Lei Yinin was very surprised to be contacted by Ouyang Shua. Back then, due to the bewitchment of her ex-boyfriend, One Sword to the West, and the mystery of the Silver Hand, Sword Qi Lei Yinin was hot-headed and betrayed the alliance of mountains and seas and joined the Yanhuang alliance. Who would have thought that the alliance of mountains and seas would counterattack so quickly? The Tingyu Tower suffered heavy losses, and Sword Qi Lei Yinin became very depressed. She left the Yanhuang alliance and did not join any side. Even in the 6th year of Gaia, the Tingyu Tower remained in Luoyang and did not move to any territory. Sword Qi Lei Yinin always felt guilty about her betrayal. Since then, she never contacted Ouyang Shua. It was as if they would never talk to each other again. One could imagine how surprised Sword Qi Lei Yinin was when she suddenly received Ouyang Shua's call request. Times have changed. When one reached Ouyang Shua's position, he had already let go of the past. Everyone had their own ambitions. Between big forces, it was normal to split and merge. Moreover, when Sword Qi Lei Yinin defected to the enemy, she warned Ouyang Shua. Ouyang Shua was willing to contact the rain-savoring building again because of this little bit of kinship. It's me. Ouyang Shua smiled. Is there something you need from me? Sword Qi Lei Yinin was a little uncertain. The situation in the Huaxia region was changing, and Great Xia was attacking Luoyang. Sword Qi Lei Yinin didn't think that Ouyang Shua was contacting her just to reminisce about the past. As a guild leader, she had a very keen sense of smell. Ouyang Shua went straight to the point. Are you interested in working together again? Working together? Sword Qi Lei Yinin pondered. She clenched her fists and couldn't help but feel waves in her heart. Today, seeing that Great Xia was getting stronger and Great Zhou was declining, it would be a lie if Sword Qi Lei Yinin said she didn't regret it. How do we work together? Sword Qi Lei Yinin was a decisive person. She had always hoped for, but never thought she could get an opportunity. Now that it had appeared in front of her again, she wasn't willing to miss it. Ouyang Shua nodded his head in satisfaction. He admired the valiant and heroic spirit of the thunderous sword aura. You should know that the Great Xia army is attacking Luoyang. If the Rain Listening Pavilion can help me with one thing, I can let bygones be bygones, and the headquarters of the Rain Listening Pavilion can be moved to Shanghai City. Sword Qi Lei Yinin didn't agree immediately. She asked, what is it? It wasn't that Sword Qi Lei Yinin was haggling. It was just that something that Ouyang Shua was so serious about must be extraordinary. She was worried that she couldn't complete it and would embarrass both parties. Help me assassinate Emperor Wu of Han or Wei Qing. At the very least, burn down the granary in Luoyang and cause chaos in Luoyang. Ouyang Shua didn't beat around the bush. Since they were working together, he had to be frank. Sword Qi Lei Yinin's heart skipped a beat after hearing this. She smiled bitterly and said, Aren't you afraid that I will leak the plan to the Great Han dynasty? This is a military secret of Great Xia, right? When she said this, Sword Qi Lei Yinin felt bitter. She was obviously thinking about the past. Ouyang Shua shook his head. You won't. It won't do Tingyu Tower any good. The Great Xia army will definitely take Luoyang. It's just a matter of time. Sword Chi Lei Yinin was silent. Of course, she understood the meaning behind Ouyang Shua's words. Since the fall of Luoyang was a sure thing, what would happen to the Tingyu Tower after the fall of Luoyang? As long as one wasn't a fool, one wouldn't offend Great Xia at this time. The Great Han Dynasty couldn't give Tingyu Tower what they wanted. Sword Chi Lei Yinin nodded. She then began to seriously consider Ouyang Shua's request and fell into deep thought. Ouyang Shua didn't rush her. He firmly believed that Tingyu Tower had been rooted in Luoyang for nearly 6 years and wouldn't have no trump cards. After a full 5 minutes, Sword Chi Lei Yinin came back to her senses. To tell you the truth, we do have some informants in the royal palace of Luoyang. However, assassinating Emperor Wu of Han is a very difficult task, and I can't guarantee that it will be completed. As for Wei Qing, he will be protected by the army. It will be harder than assassinating Emperor Wu of Han. Tingyu Tower was good at nurturing strategists and spies. It was normal for the royal palace to have spies. However, it was hard to say whether the assassination would be successful. I can think of a way to deal with the granary in Luoyang, Sword Chi Lei Yinin said. Ouyang Shua smiled after hearing this. Sure enough, Sword Chi Lei Yinin didn't disappoint him. This is already very good. I will wait for the good news in Shanghai City. Sword Chi Lei Yinin nodded. Remember, you have a week at most, Ouyang Shua warned. Got it. Next, the two of them discussed some details. Ouyang Shua even suggested letting the spies of the Shanghai guards assist Tingyu Tower in the operation to increase the success rate. After the discussion, Ouyang Shua hung up the video call. Ouyang Shua had already placed his chess piece. Whether it would be successful or not was not up to him. He could only wait patiently. However, Ouyang Shua believed that even if the assassination failed, with the cooperation of Tingyu Tower, Han Xian would definitely be able to find a way to break into Luoyang before the rations were cut off. Handan City of the Great Zhou Dynasty. The old fox has begun to mobilize his troops. I just don't know which direction he will go. Di Chan was really afraid of the Great Xia. Taking the initiative to attack the Great Jin Dynasty was Di Chen's last gamble. Otherwise, he would be destroyed by the Great Xia sooner or later. It was scary to boil a frog in warm water. Hearing this, Peerless Elegance smiled and said, no matter who the Great Xia targets, they are helping us to get rid of our internal threat. Although the 6 countries had formed an alliance, the Song, Ming, and Qing dynasties were also a big hidden danger in the Great Zhou Dynasty. It was a good thing to get rid of them with the help of the Great Xia. The Great Zhou Dynasty's plan could be said to be comprehensive. However, Di Chen was not so optimistic. It's not easy to be the fisherman. If we can't take down the Great Jin before the Great Xia succeeds, we will lose everything. Peerless Elegance nodded. So, it's time to activate the chess piece that was buried beside Feng Qiuhuang. We'll do as you say. Di Chen did not hesitate. At this point, the Great Zhou Dynasty had no way out. They had to use all the resources they could to ensure that they could take down the Great Jin Dynasty in the shortest time possible. In the next few days, the wilderness was bustling. It was as if overnight, the official roads in the wilderness were filled with troops. The armies of the Song and Ming dynasties went south one after another. The Great Xia army was busy gathering and preparing to go north. The Great Jin Dynasty was full of smoke. There was no longer an inch of pure land in the wilderness. Even the Qin and Tang dynasties, in order to guard against the revenge of the Great Xia, had secretly deployed their imperial guards to the borders. Although, according to the intelligence, the Great Xia's target was the Great Qing Dynasty, who could guarantee that the Great Xia would not make a diversion again. After all, if they took down the Tang Dynasty or the Great Qing Dynasty, they could directly connect with the Great Jin Dynasty. The Great Xia had done this many times before. Chapter 1186. The capital of the Great Qing Dynasty, the Palace of Heavenly Purity. Emperor Kangxi, who was in his 50s, had a frighteningly gloomy expression on his face. I didn't expect Great Xia to forsake what is near at hand and seek the Great Qing instead of attacking the Song and Ming kingdoms. At this moment, Kangxi was like an old lion whose hegemony had been challenged. Although he was furious, he felt powerless in the face of a young lion's challenge. Back then, Kangxi was willing to join the Six Kingdoms alliance with the intention of when the sandpiper and the clam fight, the fisherman benefits. He thought that the more the war in the south raged, the safer the Great Qing in the north would be. Who would have thought that he would be shooting himself in the foot? In the past few days, Great Xia's armies had been converging on the northern borderline province and attacking the border. Even a fool could tell what Great Xia was up to. To the Great Qing, this was like a bolt from the blue. Sanoni, Suksaha, Oh Boy, and the other ministers who were standing in the hall were also frowning. Seeing that His Majesty was enraged, Sanoni, who was the most senior among them, said, "Your Majesty, why don't we offer up the 9th continent cauldrons?" This humble subject heard that even the Qin and Tang kingdoms offered the 9-province cauldrons to Great Xia. Kangxi waved his hand. "It's useless. If it was a month ago, there might still be room for negotiation if we offered the 9-province cauldrons. Now that Great Xia has already sent out their troops, it's useless to plead for peace." Speaking of this, Kangxi felt regret. Back then, he was greedy and wanted to use the 9-province cauldrons to threaten Great Xia and obtain some benefits. He didn't expect that it would lead to the destruction of the country. In the eyes of Kangxi and the other officials, Great Xia must have come to seize the 9-province cauldrons. After all, the Song and Ming kingdoms had already offered their cauldrons. They didn't know that the Mongols were already preparing to destroy the Western Turkic Khaganate. Seeing this, Oh Boy stepped out and said, "Your Majesty, since the peace talks have failed, let's prepare for war." In history, Oh Boy was killed by little Kangxi. In the wilderness, Kangxi was older than Oh Boy. The current Oh Boy was in the prime of his life and hadn't lost the demeanor of a martial artist. He was also one of the main generals of the Qing army. After the Great Qing took over the capital, the officials that stayed behind were basically all Manchu officials. The Han officials either chose to live in seclusion or join another country. Very few of them stayed behind to serve the Great Qing. People like Yao Qixing, Zhou Peigong, Lin Zexu, and Ding Ruchong all joined Great Xia. Only Chao Yin, Nian Gingyao, and other Han officials who were entangled with Great Qing chose to stay. Kangxi nodded, but his brows did not relax. Ever since they had entered Jingdo, the Jingdo Imperial Army had automatically been replaced by the Iron Cavalry of the 8 Banners. Trapped in the narrow and small Jingdo County, they had no room to display their abilities. Facing the Great Xia army, it was truly worrying how much of his strength he could display. The Qing army was not known for its ferocity. However, it was just as Oh Boy had said, no matter how difficult it was, the Great Qing already had no way out. They could only fight with their backs against the river. "Pass down my order. Prepare for battle," Kangxi ordered. "Yes, Your Majesty." The ministers echoed, but their voices were not very loud. Some people's eyes were already flickering. Mongolia, Hala, and Lin. In the golden tent, Genghis Khan sat boldly on the throne. Bogorchi and Mahwali of the 4 heroes, Jeeb of the 4 braves, and Talyui of the 4 sons were all present. "Father, if Great Xia attacks the Great Qing now, the Liaojin province will definitely be defenseless. This son suggests that while attacking the Western Turks, we split up our troops to attack the Liaojin province. We will definitely win this battle." The one who spoke was Talyui. As Genghis Khan's favorite prince and the one who understood military affairs the best, Talyui, who had appeared in the wilderness, was vaguely ranked first among all the princes. This was because in the game world, there was no problem of succession. When Talyui said this, Mahwali and Jeeb also agreed with him, looking rather excited. After lying dormant for a year, these war maniacs could no longer hold themselves back and wanted nothing more than a fight every day. Genghis Khan shook his head at Talyui's suggestion. "The Great Xia is a lion. As a hunter, when you don't have the strength to kill a lion, it is extremely unwise to provoke a lion in the prime of its life. Father, As long as you give me 200,000 elite soldiers, your son will definitely be able to take down the Liao Jin, Taoyui said rather unwillingly. There's no need to say more. I've already made up my mind. Genghis Khan's will could not be shaken. Turning to the eager Mawali and the others, he sternly said, taking down the Western Turks is the most urgent task at hand. The Turks are vicious wolves of the steppe. Do not let your guard down. Yes. Mawali and the others did not dare to be impudent and respectfully accepted the order. This matter cannot be delayed. Order the front lines to immediately move out and take down the Western Turks within a month. This is to prevent any delays in the war in the Central Plains, Genghis Khan ordered. Yes, with Genghis Khan's order, the two heroes of the steppe were about to engage in a battle to the death. July 24th, Luoyang. 4 days had passed since Ouyang Shua had communicated with Thundersword Qi. The street battles in Luoyang were still in a stalemate. Although the Han army was constantly being pushed back by the advance of the Great Xiao army, they were still able to hold on. Wei Qing did not panic at all. According to the reports from the spies, the Great Jin had already cut off the rations of the Great Xiao army. At present, the Great Xiao army was searching for rations everywhere, and the rations stored in the barracks would not last much longer. If this continued, the final victor would be the burly man. Unfortunately, Wei Qing, who had been commanding at the front lines, had no idea that in these few days an undercurrent had gradually taken shape in the inner city of Luoyang. Everything was ready except for the final push. The plan to assassinate Emperor Wu of Han was already nearing its end, and all that was left was the final blow. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Weiyang Palace. The torrential rain had stopped, and the drizzling rain made Weiyang Palace appear mysterious and desolate. Under the guidance of a eunuch, Thundersword Qi was preparing to visit Emperor Wu of Han at the Announcement Palace Hall. The reason was that, as the largest guild in Luoyang, the Tingyu Tower was willing to do its best to help during the crisis in Luoyang. During the fierce battle in Luoyang, every force was of help to the burly man and could increase their chances of winning the war, let alone a super guild like the Tingyu Tower. With the help of some people and the recommendation of a minister, Thundersword Qi's trip to the palace was finally possible. Over the past 4 days, the Mountain Sea Guards and the Tingyu Tower had used all the resources they could and spent a lot of money. After putting in a lot of hard work, they finally obtained this admission ticket. That was all they could do. The success of the subsequent assassination would depend on Thundersword Qi's performance on the spot. In order to cooperate with Great Xia again, Thundersword Qi had thrown caution to the wind and actually went into action personally. One had to know that if the assassination failed, Thundersword Qi would not be able to walk out of the palace alive. On the way to the Announcement Palace, Thundersword Qi was checked 3 times by the palace guards. Each time, the checks were stricter than the last to ensure that Thundersword Qi did not carry any sharp weapons. Even an embroidery needle was not allowed. Thundersword Qi cooperated with the guards all the way. She was very patient and did not feel nervous at all, because the weapon she brought this time was the shadow-bearing sword, one of the 10 famous swords. It had a shadow and was invisible. It was raining, and she could not even see a shadow. Even so, she did not carry the shadow-bearing sword with her, in case the Imperial Guards found any flaws. When he was close to the Hall of Announcement and all the searches were over, Thundersword Energy quietly took the shadow-bearing sword from a eunuch who was on duty outside the Hall of Announcement without leaving a trace. That eunuch was naturally one of the pawns of the Tingyu Tower. In order to choose the time when the eunuch was on duty to meet Emperor Wu of Han, the Tingyu Tower had put in a lot of effort. The whole plan was closely linked. After entering the main hall, the security suddenly weakened. Except for the Imperial Guards on duty outside the hall, there was not a single guard in the main hall. Only 2 eunuchs on duty accompanied Emperor Wu of Han. As a master in Jianghu, Thundersword Qi would not be confused by this appearance. Under her perception, there were Imperial Guards behind the screen of the main hall, on the beam of the roof, and other secret places. Even those 2 eunuchs were not ordinary people. Looking at Emperor Wu of Han, who was sitting above, Thundersword Qi saluted, Sword Chi Thunder Sword Chi pays respect to your majesty. Emperor Wu of Han was also an emperor who was used to great winds and waves. Although Luoyang might fall at any time, there was not a trace of abnormality in his expression. He was unfathomable and awe-inspiring. When Thunder Sword Chi saw him, she could not help feeling stagnant. I am very relieved that the Tingyu Tower can stand up to share the burden of the imperial court when it is in danger. Once the crisis in Luoyang is resolved, I can confer you the title of Marquis. In order to win over the Tingyu Tower, Emperor Wu of Han spared no expense. Thunder Sword Chi was very excited when she heard that. Thank you for your kindness, your majesty. To be honest, if it was before, she would be ecstatic if Emperor Wu of Han was willing to confer her the title of Marquis, because it meant that the Tingyu Tower could do whatever it wanted in the territory of the Han dynasty. But now it was nothing at all. Just when Thunder Sword Chi thanked the emperor and was about to get up, a sharp arrow was shot from outside the hall, through the paper-made door and into the hall like a sharp arrow. Assassin, protect his majesty. Thunder Sword Chi said as she rushed to Emperor Wu of Han. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Almost at the same time, 5 imperial guards appeared out of thin air in the hall and formed a formation in front of Emperor Wu of Han. The 2 eunuchs also stood in front of Emperor Wu of Han like shadows, ready to fight. Because Thunder Sword Chi did not carry a weapon, and she was innocent and had just been conferred by His Majesty, the 2 eunuchs only thought that she was here to protect His Majesty when they saw Thunder Sword Chi rushing at them. They did not know that the sharp arrow outside the hall was to create an assassination opportunity for Thunder Sword Chi. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.